Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you're here. Whatever brought you here tonight, a long day, a restless mind, or just the wish for a quiet corner to rest in, I'm glad you found your way. If these slow journeys into the past have ever helped you relax or drift off to sleep, leaving a like and subscribing helps this little channel find someone else who needs it too. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you know. And if you have a moment, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Leave it in the comments, and we'll keep each other company. So get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe turn on a soft fan for that gentle hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight, we're stepping quietly into the long story of the Great Plagues, and more than that, into the small, ordinary ways people live through them. To see what those days really felt like. Now, I know how that sounds, spoken aloud in a quiet room, but I promise you, this is not a frightening story. It is, in its own particular way, one of the gentlest stories history has to offer. Because tonight is not about the sickness itself, not really. It is about the people, the ordinary, unremarkable, quietly remarkable people, who kept their households going while the world outside grew strange. It is about bread still baked, and water still carried, and lamps still lit at dusk. It is about neighbours leaving soup on doorsteps, and the small, stubborn routines that carried whole cities through their hardest seasons. People endured these times, my friend, far more often than not. They survived. And the ways they survived were almost entirely small ones. A clean cup of water, a warm blanket, a familiar voice in the next room. That is the story we're walking into tonight. So picture it like this. You are standing at the top of a long, dim corridor, the corridor of the centuries, and someone has gone ahead of you, lighting a little oil lamp in each doorway. The flames are small and steady, one for every age of the world, stretching away into a soft darkness that holds no menace at all, only distance. You can smell the faint sweetness of the burning oil. The floor is worn smooth by every generation that has ever walked it before you. There is no hurry here. There is nowhere else you need to be. We're simply going to walk, you and I, from lamp to lamp, from century to century, and in each one we will step through a doorway and stand a while in somebody's ordinary evening. We will warm our hands at their fires. We will listen to their kettles and their looms and their church bells, and when each visit is done we will slip out quietly, the way good guests do, and walk on. The first doorway is a long way back, at about 2,500 years, give or take a generation. So as we walk, let the centuries slide past you gently, like fields seen from a slow train at night. Somewhere in the dark, the modern world falls away behind us. The hum of traffic fades. The electric glow dims to candlelight, then to firelight, then to the small clay lamps of the ancient world. And as the last of the corridor opens out, you find yourself standing on a low hillside above the sea, in the warm blue hour just after sunset, somewhere on the shores of the ancient Mediterranean. Take a moment here. Feel how soft the air is. It smells of salt and sun-warmed stone, of wild thyme crushed underfoot, of olive wood smoke drifting from somewhere down the slope. Below you the sea has gone the colour of dark wine, and it moves against the shore with a slow, patient hush. The same sound, exactly the same sound, that people have fallen asleep to on this coast for 100 centuries. Cicadas are winding down their long day's music in the olive trees. A donkey complains softly once somewhere behind a wall and thinks better of it. And scattered along the darkening coast you can see the small lights coming on. Oil lamps in doorways, cooking fires in courtyards, each one a household settling in for the evening, each one a little island of warmth in the gathering dark. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, I think, because those small lights are really what this whole night is about. For as long as people have gathered close together, in villages, in port towns, and great walled cities, sickness has sometimes come to visit them. It arrived with ships and with armies, with trade goods and travellers, quietly, the way weather arrives. That is simply part of what it has always meant to live close to one another. But here is the other half of it, the half that history tends to whisper rather than shout. Every single time in every century, ordinary people found quiet ways to endure it. They nursed each other. They shared what they had. They kept the bread ovens warm and the water jars filled. And they sat with one another through the long nights. And then, this is the part we forget, the mornings came back. The markets reopened. The lamps were lit again. The story of the plagues is, underneath everything, a story about how sturdy an ordinary household can be. And so we begin where the written story itself begins, with the first great sickness anyone described carefully enough for us to walk through it beside them. Down this hillside, a few miles inland, there is a city, the most famous city of its age, ringed by strong stone walls and crowded this particular summer with far more people than it was ever built to hold. It is the year we would call 430 before the Common Era, and the city is Athens. There is a war on, though tonight you would hardly know it. What you would notice instead is the smell of barley bread and the creak of a well rope, and a young woman in an ivory-white chiton lighting the evening lamp. Her name, for our purposes tonight, is Corinna. Let's go down and meet her. The path down the hillside is pale in the last light, worn smooth between dry stone walls, and it carries you gently toward the city gates. Even from here you can tell that Athens is fuller than it should be. The war with Sparta is in its second summer, and the great statesman Pericles has asked everyone in the countryside of Attica to come inside the walls and let the farmland fend for itself. So whole villages have folded themselves into the city. Grandmothers and beehives, goats and looms, all of it carried in on carts and shoulders. Families are camped in the shrines and the open squares, in huts knocked together from whatever timber could be found, and some, believe it or not, are living quite snugly inside the towers of the city wall itself. 2 long stone walls run all the way down to the harbour at Piraeus, 4 miles of them, keeping the road to the sea safe, and even the strip of ground between those walls has sprouted a village of tents and lean-tos, laundry strung between them like festival banners. You slip through the gate with the last of the evening crowd, past a sleepy guard leaning on his spear, and into the streets. They are narrow and warm, still breathing back the heat of the day from their mud brick walls. The air smells of dust and donkeys, of garlic and frying fish, of time-scented smoke from 100 small cooking fires. Somewhere a potter's wheel is still turning in the Kerameikos, the potter's quarter, with a low wet hum. And at the door of a modest house near the edge of that district, a small clay lamp has just been set in a niche beside the doorpost, next to the little stone pillar of Hermes that watches over the threshold of nearly every home in this city. This is Corinna's house. She's about 25, with dark hair pinned in a low knot, and she moves through her evening tasks with the unhurried certainty of someone who has done them 1,000 times. Step inside with her. No one will mind. The house is built the way most Athenian houses are, a few small rooms gathered around a little open courtyard, with the family altar in the middle and the summer stars for a ceiling. The courtyard is crowded these days. Corinna's husband has cousins from a farming village out near the olive groves, and when the war pushed everyone inside the walls, the cousins came here. An old aunt, a young wife, 3 children, and 1 indignant hen in a wicker basket. Bedding is rolled against every wall. It is a tight fit, and yet there is something companionable about it, the way a full house hums even when nobody is speaking. Corinna kneels at the low hearth and coaxes the fire up under a clay pot of lentils, stirring in a little olive oil and a pinch of dried herbs. On a flat stone beside her rest the barley cakes she made this afternoon. Marza, the everyday bread of Athens, dense and nutty and honest. Wheat bread is for festivals, barley is for life. There are olives in a bowl, a piece of white cheese, a few figs from the aunt's own trees, picked before the family left the farm and hoarded like treasure. The children are given theirs first, and the old aunt is given the softest cake. And no one in this courtyard will go to sleep hungry tonight, which in a city under siege is its own quiet victory, and Corinna knows it. Earlier today, if you had followed her, you would have seen the errand that anchors every Athenian woman's morning. The walk to the fountain house, a tall water jar balanced with impossible ease. The city's springs run cool and clear through stone lion-headed spouts, and the fountain house is where the women of the neighbourhood trade news while their jars fill. Who has room to lodge another family, whose cousin arrived from the countryside, what the fishmongers are charging now, which is scandalous. Water in this city is carried home by hand, 1 jarful at a time and poured with care. Remember that detail, my friend. Hold on to it gently. Water carried by hand from wells and fountains and rain-filled cisterns is going to matter a great deal in this story. By dusk the Agra, the great marketplace, is emptying out. The stalls are shuttered, the money changers have folded their tables, and the marble colonnades hold the day's warmth like bread fresh from the oven. A few men linger there still, talking the slow evening talk of politics and harvests and the war. Always the war, though it feels far away tonight. A matter of ships and speeches rather than anything you could touch. An owl, Athena's own bird, calls once from the direction of the Acropolis. where the new temple of the goddess stands pale against the first stars, not yet 20 years old, and already the most beautiful thing most of these people have ever seen. From up there, the watchman can see the whole crowded city breathing below. 10,000 small fires, 10,000 suppers, the hum of far too many people packed inside one ring of stone, making the best of it. Back in the courtyard, the lamps are burning low. The clay lamp gives about as much light as a single candle. A soft gold circle, just big enough for one face, so evenings here end early and gently. The cousins' children are asleep in a heap, like puppies. The old aunt is telling, for perhaps the 40th time, the story of the year. The olive harvest was so heavy the branches touched the ground, and Corinna listens as if she has never heard it, because that is a kind of kindness too. Then the fire is banked, the door is barred, and the house settles into the warm dark. The city sleeps, crowded and uncomfortable and safe behind its walls, and it is in these very weeks, history tells us, the early summer of that second year of the war, that something new comes quietly up the road from the harbour at Piraeus, where the trading ships tie up from Egypt and the islands. Not an army. Nothing you could see from the watchtower at all. Just a sickness, come ashore from the wide world into the fullest city in Greece. It moves the way news moves at first, from the harbour, up the long-walled road, into the crowded lanes. One household hears of it from another. A neighbour's lodger is feverish. A fish seller has shut his stall. The woman 2 doors down is keeping her children in the courtyard this week. Nobody announces anything. The city simply grows a little quieter, street by street, the way a room grows quieter when rain begins. At the fountain house, the talk turns careful and low, and the jars are filled a little faster than usual, and the women walk home holding their news as gently as their water. In Corinna's courtyard, the change arrives as a task rather than a terror. The young cousin-wife takes a fever, and so the household does what households have always done. It rearranges itself around her. A sleeping mat is moved into the coolest room, the one that catches the morning shade. The other children are shooed to the far side of the courtyard, where the aunt keeps them busy sorting lentils and being scandalised by her stories. And Corinna, calm as deep water, takes up the oldest work in the world, the tending. She wrings cloths in cool water for the young woman's forehead. She props her up to sip barley water, a spoonful at a time. She keeps the lamp burning through the small hours, because everything is more bearable with a little light, and she hums quietly, the way you hum to a child, because a voice nearby is a kind of medicine too. What this sickness wanted more than anything was cold water. Those who had it were thirsty in a way they could hardly describe, and they dreamed of springs and rain barrels, and the tenderest thing anyone could do was to sit beside them, patiently with a cup. We know these small details, so the thirst, the fever, the long weeks of it, because one particular Athenian caught the sickness himself, recovered, and then did something quietly extraordinary. He wrote it all down, plainly and carefully, so that if it ever came again, people would recognise it. His name was Thucydides. He was a soldier and a historian, and in the middle of writing his great chronicle of the war, he set down what the plague was truly like for ordinary people. Not to frighten anyone, he said, but so the knowledge would be there, like a lamp left burning for strangers he would never meet. Historians still wonder, all these centuries later, exactly what the illness was. Typhoid, some say, or typhus, or something the world no longer has. And the honest answer is that nobody quite knows. The mystery has outlived everything but his kindness in recording it, and tucked inside his account is the detail I most want you to carry to sleep tonight. Thucydides noticed that the people who recovered from the sickness never caught it a second time, or never badly. The survivors realised this about themselves, and so it was they, above all, who went from house to house doing the nursing. They had been through it. They knew the thirst and the fever from the inside, and they knew, with a confidence no physician could offer, that it would not take them. He tells us they were congratulated in the streets, these recovered ones, and that in the first flush of survival some of them half believed they would never die of anything at all ever, which is, I think, one of the most human sentences ever written. Without knowing a single thing about how immunity works, the city had discovered it by heart, and turned it almost immediately into an act of care. So picture the city through that difficult summer, not as a tragedy but as 10,000 small acts of tending, happening behind 10,000 doors, broth simmering, cloths wrung out, survivors with their sleeves rolled up, moving from courtyard to courtyard like a quiet guild, the physicians doing their brave, baffled best, the temples full of soft voices and lamp smoke, and on the doorsteps covered dishes left by neighbours who could spare a little, for households that could not. There was grief in Athens that year, of course there was, and the city marked it the way cities do, with candles and processions and bells of bronze, with names remembered over the evening fire. We will let that grief rest where it lies, at a respectful distance like a lit window seen from across a valley. Because here is the thing the fearful histories tend to leave out. The city held. The walls were kept. The ships still came and went from Piraeus. The fountain houses never stopped running, and the barley never stopped arriving, and every single morning someone in every lane got up and lit the fire anyway. The young cousin wife in Corinna's courtyard mends slowly, the way people did, first sitting up, then complaining about the food, which everyone agrees is an excellent sign. Then finally out in the sunshine again, thinner and quieter, shelling beans with the aunt. By the time the first autumn rains come, sweet and cold, rinsing the dust from the air and drumming softly on the tiled roofs, the sickness is loosening its grip on the city. It will come back in smaller waves, and then it will go for good. And Athens, bruised, thinned, but unmistakably Athens, will simply carry on being itself for centuries more. Arguing, building, mixing wine with water, telling stories at dusk. On our last evening here, the agora smells of rain and roasted chestnuts, and the owl calls again from the Acropolis, and Corinna sets the little lamp in its niche by the door, exactly as she has every night of her life. Endurance, it turns out, looks remarkably like routine, and that is a truth worth carrying with us as we leave this doorway and walk on down the corridor. Aye, 5.5 centuries on to a far bigger city, the biggest the world has yet seen. A city of 1 million people, of aqueducts and bathhouses and bread ovens that never cool, where a physician named Galen is about to meet a sickness of his own age, and where a woman named Livia keeps a lamp burning in a townhouse on a quiet street. Rome is waiting for us, my friend. And Rome, when you step through its doorway in the corridor, greets you first with sound. Even at dusk, this city hums like a hive settling, 1 million people, give or take, stacked and folded into brick apartment blocks and narrow streets, and beneath the hum the steady silver sound of water. Because Rome, wonderfully, is a city of running water. 9 great aqueducts stride in over the hills on their stone arches, and on nearly every corner a public fountain splashes into its basin all day and all night, free for anyone with a jug. After Athens and its hand-carried jars, it sounds like extravagance. It is the year 165 of the Common Era, the high summer of the Empire, and the evening air smells of wood smoke, baking bread, and the warm resin of umbrella pines. The house we are visiting stands on a quieter street on one of the hills, a modest townhouse with a plain brick face that keeps its loveliness inside as Roman houses do. Push aside the leather door curtain and the street simply vanishes. You are in the atrium, a cool dim hall where a square pool of rainwater lies still as dark glass beneath a matching square of evening sky. And here is Livia, the lady of this small house, about 35, black hair in a simple braided crown, an ivory stola, a muted red shawl over her shoulders, standing at the household shrine in the corner with a taper in her hand. Every Roman home has one of these little shrines, a miniature temple on the wall for the lares, the small bronze guardians of the family. Each evening Livia lights the lamp before them and sets down a morsel of spelt cake, and whatever else is happening in the world, that small flame gets lit. Hold on to that flame, my friend. It is going to carry this whole household, because something has followed the legions home this year. Far away in the east there has been a war with Parthia, and the returning soldiers, marching back along the fine straight roads with their pay and their souvenirs, have brought an unseen companion, a fever that moves from town to town along the very roads and shipping lanes that make the empire one thing. By next year it will be in Rome itself. People will come to call it the Antonine Plague, after the family name of the emperors, and among those who stay to study it is the most famous physician who ever lived, a brisk, brilliant, magnificently confident Greek named Galen, personal doctor to emperors, who examines the sick, notes the fever and the 2 weeks of rash, and writes it all down in his careful notes. Notes which, 17 centuries later, would let scholars guess it was probably smallpox, though historians still wonder softly to this day. Galen's actual remedies were a mixed bag, as all remedies were then, but what he prescribed most, underneath everything, was the oldest medicine of all: rest and nourishing broth, and thyme, barley soup in fact, Athens would have approved. And what does a great sickness look like from inside Livia's house, smaller than you would think? It looks like the morning walk to the bakery shortened and brisk. A coin counted into a floury hand, the round loaf tucked under the shawl still warm. It looks like the kitchen girl simmering Egyptian lentils with a splash of vinegar and a bay leaf, because plain food is comfort food in any century. It looks like Livia sending a covered pot of that same lentil soup across the lane to the widow whose household is down with the fever, and taking her turn to sit with the woman through the afternoon, wringing cloths in cool aqueduct water in the exact same patient rhythm as Corinna 5 centuries before her. Nobody taught them this in common. It is simply what tending looks like, everywhere, always. The city, meanwhile, does the thing that great cities do, which is to carry on being itself. The fountains run, the grain dole is handed out as always, sacks of wheat from Africa and Egypt, shipped across the sea to the port at Ostia, hauled up the Tiber on barges, so that even in a plague year the ovens of Rome never go cold. The great public baths stay warm and busy, marble halls full of steam and echoes, where for a small copper coin anyone, rich or poor, can soak the day's worries out of their shoulders. A Roman would sooner skip supper than skip the baths, and there is a case to be made that all that hot water and soap-scraped skin was quietly on the side of survival. The emperor himself, a serious, gentle-hearted man named Marcus Aurelius, who writes philosophy to himself in a notebook at night, arranges for victims of the plague to be buried at public expense, which is the state, in its own stiff way, leaving soup on a doorstep. People reached for comfort where they could find it, of course. There was a travelling oracle seller in those years, a rogue, if we are honest, who did a roaring trade in a single line of verse that promised Apollo would keep the plague cloud away. And all across the empire, families chalked and carved that one hopeful line over their doorways. It probably did nothing at all. But I find I cannot laugh at it quite. A line of poetry over the door is just a lamplit in another language. The fever years came in waves, and then, as they always do, they ebbed. The empire bent and did not break. The roads stayed open. The accounts were kept. And in Livia's atrium the little flame before the household gods was lit every single evening, straight through, until the evenings were ordinary again. Survival here was not a battle won. It was a routine kept. Bread, broth, baths, and the shrine lamp, repeated daily until the world came back. But notice, before we slip out through the door curtain, that detail we passed almost without looking. A city too big to feed itself, kept alive by grain ships crossing the sea from Egypt. Rome taught the ancient world that trick, and the ancient world never forgot it. 4 centuries on from Livia's quiet street, there will be a newer Rome far to the east, a golden city on the Bosphorus called Constantinople, fed by those same Egyptian wheat fleets, sail after sail after sail. And it is there, down at the harbour where the grain ships tie up, that the next part of our story is waiting, in the flower-dusted kitchen of a baker's wife. The lamplight carries you on, past Livia's quiet courtyard, past the long slow centuries where Rome mends and fades, and the road beneath you turns gently toward the east. Nearly 400 years slip by in the dark, the way miles slip by under a traveller who is half asleep, and when the light lifts again you are standing beside the sea. It is the year 541, and the city rising before you on its 7 hills is Constantinople, the new Rome, wrapped in the pale gold of an early spring morning. 500,000 people live inside these walls, more than in any other city in the world, and at this hour almost all of them are only just beginning to stir. You stand at the harbour of Theodosius on the Marmara shore, where the great grain ships from Alexandria ride at anchor, their hulls heavy and low in the water. Egypt feeds this city and has for centuries. Sack after sack of wheat comes up the gangplanks on the shoulders of stevedores, bound for the state granaries along the quay. You can smell tar and salt and wet rope, and underneath it all, faint and constant, the dusty sweetness of grain, the smell of a city that will eat well tonight. Follow the carts uphill, away from the water, into streets that are waking one shutter at a time, and let the city introduce itself slowly as cities do. The main avenue is called the Messe, a long colonnaded street paved in worn stone, where porticos shelter little shops selling oil and olives, candles, sandals, and small silver things. Somewhere ahead of you a Simentron is being beaten, a long wooden board struck with a mallet, calling the early monks to prayer with a sound like a patient heartbeat. and drifting through every lane, warmer than the sunlight, comes the smell you have been following without knowing it. The smell of bread, hundreds of ovens of it. In a narrow street below the aqueduct there is a bakery with a worn stone threshold, and standing in its doorway, dusting flour from her hands, is a woman named Theodosia. She's the baker's wife, somewhere near 40, and she's been awake since long before light, because bread in this city is not a luxury but a promise. The emperor's officials count the loaves and watch the scales, for much of Constantinople's bread is given out by the state, baked from Egyptian wheat, round and pale and stamped. Theodosia's husband tends the oven. She tends everything else, the counter, the accounts, the apprentice who daydreams, and the neighbours who arrive with their own dough to bake for a small coin. Stay a while in her doorway and watch the morning come to the street, the water seller with his clay jars, the fishmonger crying fresh mackerel up from the Golden Horn. An old man settles onto a bench with a heel of yesterday's loaf and a few olives, and eats them slowly, like a man who has decided the day can wait. Beneath your feet, though you cannot see it, lies one of the city's quietest wonders, for Constantinople keeps its water the way other cities keep treasure, underground and in the dark. Under the streets near the great church there is a cistern finished barely 10 years ago, a drowned palace of 336 marble columns, holding a lake of cool rainwater. The aqueduct of Verland strides across the valley on its double row of arches to fill it, and on hot afternoons the cistern stairs breathe out air as cool as a cave. Above ground, the city's newest wonder is scarcely 5 years old, the great church of Hagia Sophia, its shallow dome floating over the rooftops like a second, gentler sky. People here like to repeat what the historian Procopius wrote, that the dome does not seem to rest on stone at all, but to hang from heaven by a golden chain. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment, a whole city running its errands beneath a dome hung from heaven, bread under one arm, the sea at every street's end. But this spring, something else has come up from the harbour with the wheat, something no stevedore saw and no official counted, riding quietly in the warm dark of the grain sacks. The sickness began far away, in the Egyptian port of Pelusium, and it has travelled the sea roads all winter from Alexandria along the coasts the way cargo does. No one in Constantinople understands yet what is moving among them, and it will be 13 centuries before anyone learns the truth of it, a matter of fleas and rats and ships. The people of this city will only know that a hard season has come, and that it must be gotten through, the way winters are and droughts and long wars. It begins slowly, a few households here and there near the harbours, a fever, a heaviness, a swelling. The physicians are puzzled, and say so, which is its own kind of honesty. Then, week by week through the spring, the city begins to slow, the way a great wheel slows so gradually that at first no one can say exactly when it changed. The messy grows quieter, shops open late or not at all. The chariot races are thin of crowds, then thinner, and the shouting from the hippodrome fades like a tide going out. Procopius, who lives through these months, writes that work of every description ceased, that craftsmen set down their tools, and that a city famous for abundance learned to keep a plain table. People stay in when they can, doors shut against the streets, and the great avenues that held 500,000 hurried footsteps hold, for a while, mostly sunlight and pigeons. The city does not fall silent exactly. It holds its breath, the way a household does when someone upstairs is sleeping at last and every floorboard has become a matter of care. And through it all, in the narrow street below the aqueduct, Theodosia keeps the oven lit, because whatever else stops, people still come to her threshold for bread. Fewer loaves now, and the queue stands farther apart than it used to, but she hands each loaf over warm with a word for everyone, the way her mother taught her. In the evenings she counts what is left in the flour bins, sets aside a measure for a widow 2 doors down, and banks the oven's fire with the ash rake. Small acts, repeated daily, are what survival is mostly made of in this century and in every other one. The city is about to prove that, house by house. So as the lamps are lit along the quiet messy, and the grain ships swing at their moorings, let us go inside with Theodosia, and see how a household weathers such a season. Inside, the bakery's back room is small and warm, lit by a single clay lamp burning olive oil, its flame no bigger than a thumbnail and steady as a kept promise. Theodosia's household has drawn itself in close, the way households do in hard seasons, her husband, the apprentice, an elderly aunt, and a neighbour's boy whose family is nursing their own. Supper is lentils stewed with onions and a little oil, yesterday's bread softened in the broth, and watered wine passed around the table in one cup, in no particular hurry. This is what managing looks like. Mostly smaller meals, earlier nights, doors answered carefully, and the day's news traded in low voices so as not to trouble the sleeping aunt. Across the city, people have taken up a small, careful habit that an eyewitness named John would remember all his life, and it is worth knowing about because it is so human. Those who must go out wear little tags written with their name and their street, so that if the sickness takes them suddenly, some stranger will know where to carry them home. Even in the strangest months of its long history, this city assumed there would be a stranger kind enough to stop, and there nearly always was. The sick are mostly nursed at home, with cool water and clean cloths and patience. There are hospitals too, like the Sampson House near the great church, where attendants keep long, gentle watches. Procopius wrote that the tenders of the sick grew tired in a way sleep could not quite mend, and yet, morning after morning, they got up and tended anyway. Broth is carried up staircases. Water jars are filled at the fountains for neighbours who cannot fetch their own. Someone always seems to know which door to knock on softly. Even the emperor is not spared. Justinian himself takes the fever, and the palace goes very quiet, and the whole city waits, and then, slowly, remarkably, he recovers. It is a strange comfort, but a real one. If the sickness can be survived in a palace, it can be survived in a room above a bakery too. The emperor gives one of his officials, a careful man named Theodore, the task of seeing that the dead are honoured and settled, and Theodore spends the treasury freely to do it gently. The bells and the chanted litanies carry across the rooftops at dusk, and candle by candle, window by window, the city keeps its people company to the very edge of the dark. When grief needs somewhere to go, it goes to Hagia Sophia. The doors stand open through these months, and inside, the great space receives everyone the same way, without hurry, without question. Hundreds of oil lamps hang on bronze rings below the dome, and their small flames, multiplied by gold mosaic, make an evening light that seems to come from everywhere at once. Theodosia comes in the evenings when the ovens are cold and stands near a pillar with her shawl drawn close, and lets the chanting settle over her like warm water. She lights one candle for her sister across the Golden Horn, and one for the widow 2 doors down, and one quietly for nobody in particular, which may be the kindest kind. 4 months, the worst of it, last in Constantinople. Historians still wonder, gently and without agreement, how many the city lost. The old chroniclers wrote numbers almost too large to hold. But numbers were never the whole story, and they are not the story tonight. The story is that the wheel, having slowed almost to stillness, begins to turn again. It happens the way morning happens, not all at once. 1 week the sementron sounds and more feet answer it. 1 week the fish market smells of fish again. A rope walk reopens by the harbour. A wedding is held in a small parish church, modest and defiant and full of borrowed flowers, and half the street finds a reason to pass by. The grain fleets come in with the autumn, and the stevedores' chant returns to the harbour of Theodosius, and the granaries take their wheat like great stone animals being fed. And in the narrow street below the aqueduct, before dawn on an ordinary Tuesday, Theodosia's husband fires the big oven full again for the first time since spring. Theodosia sets the first loaves out on the counter while the sky is still the colour of slate, and the smell of them moves down the street like a rumour of good news. One by one the doors open. One by one the neighbours come, coins warm from their hands, and stand in the old loose queue, closer together than they stood in June. Nobody makes a speech about it. Somebody complains mildly that the loaves are smaller than before, and Theodosia tells him he's welcome to knead the next batch himself. There is quiet laughter in the queue, the first in a long while, and it is astonishing how much a city can rebuild on a foundation no sturdier than that. Cities remember these seasons in their own way, not in monuments mostly, but in habits. A fondness for full storerooms, a certain tenderness toward neighbours, a respect for clean deep water. The great cisterns are kept fuller after this, and the granaries watched more carefully, and for a generation people who lived through this spring keep bread with a particular reverence. They finish their loaves to the last crumb, and if a piece falls they pick it up and kiss it, an old habit that suddenly means something again. The sickness will drift back through the Mediterranean world in waves for 2 centuries, thinner each time, and then it will fade from these shores for hundreds of years. Constantinople goes on being Constantinople. The race is run, the lamps are lit beneath the floating dome, the water waits cool and patient in its dark marble forest under the streets. and Theodosia grows old in the bakery doorway, dusting flour from her hands at the end of each day, one small keeper of one small threshold, which is how cities are actually kept. Let her image stay with you as the lamplight gathers you up again, because you will meet her kind in every century this night still holds. The road ahead runs west now, and a long way north, away from marble and warm seas, toward a smaller, greener, rainier world of hedgerows and thatch. 800 years will pass under your feet as gently as a change in the weather, and when you next stop walking you will be standing on a cart track in England. The cart track is soft underfoot, 2 worn ruts with grass down the middle, and it is early morning in England, somewhere in the green heart of the country, in the early 1340s. Mist lies along the stream in a soft grey ribbon, and somewhere beyond the hedgerow a wood pigeon is saying the same 5 sleepy syllables over and over, entirely satisfied with them. Follow the track around its unhurried bend, and there is the village. Perhaps 30 households gathered along one street, their thatched roofs the colour of old honey in the first light. Smoke is starting to rise from the roofs, not from chimneys, for there are none, but seeping up through the thatch itself, so each cottage seems to steam gently like fresh bread. At one end of the street stands the church, small and square-towered and grey. At the other, behind its fish pond and dovecote, the manor house where the Lord Steward keeps the accounts. Between them lie the open fields, 3 great fields farmed in long strips, so that from the church tower the land looks like a striped blanket smoothed over the low hills. Everyone here holds a scattering of those strips, and everyone knows everyone's strips, and whose ox is whose, and which gate sticks, and precisely who left it open last autumn. It is a world barely 200 people wide, and it is about to become the home of this night's journey for a good long while, so let it settle in around you. Halfway along the street, set back behind a low wattle fence, there is a cottage with a garden that is clearly loved, and this is the one we have come to find. The woman opening its door just now, a wooden bucket in one hand, is called Agnes, and for the next many miles of this night she will be our companion. She's about 30, with chestnut hair braided beneath a white linen kerchief, and grey-blue eyes, and the gentle, work-worn hands of a woman who has never once been idle on purpose. Her kirtle is a deep russet wool, her apron plain linen, and over the fence she's already having the day's first conversation, with a hen who has opinions about the gate. Agnes and her husband hold a modest holding of the manor, a dozen strips in the fields grazing for one cow, the garden, the pig, the hens, and the cottage itself. In return they owe the Lord certain days of work on his land, extra hands at harvest and small fees at the manor court, all written carefully in the steward's roll. It is not an easy arrangement, but it is a known one, and there is a certain rest in knowing exactly what is owed and exactly what is yours. Step through the gate she's just gone through, past the hen who allows it, and have a look at the cottage, because you will come to know it well. It is one long room and a smaller one cruck-framed, the curved oak timbers rising like whale ribs, the walls woven hazel, plastered with daub and washed pale with lime. The floor is packed earth strewn with rushes, and in the middle of it the hearth burns low on its flat stones, the fire that is never allowed to go out entirely. Smoke drifts up into the dark of the roof, among the rafters where a flitch of bacon hangs curing, and finds its slow way out through the thatch. There is a trestle table, 2 benches, a chest for the linens, an iron cauldron on its pot-hook, wooden bowls, horn spoons, and one prized brass pot that was Agnes's mother's. The bed in the smaller room is a wooden frame laced with rope, a mattress stuffed with fresh straw, and wool blankets that smell faintly and pleasantly of sheep. By the door hangs a distaff, wound with carded wool ready to be picked up at any idle moment, of which there are famously few. Outside the garden holds its small green parliament, cabbages and kale, leeks and onions, beans climbing their sticks, garlic, parsley, and a bed of herbs, sage and thyme and feverfew and betony. There is a strawberry skep against the south wall, a woodpile stacked with real artistry, and the pig, round and companionable, dozing in her corner like a well-fed abbess. This is the whole estate, and it is enough. Kept fed, kept mended, kept going, it will carry 2 people through a year with even a little to spare. The village around it runs on the same quiet arithmetic. The miller grinds every household's grain at the Lord's mill, taking his portion, about which there are traditional and affectionate complaints. The smith's hammer keeps a lazy rhythm from his forge by the green. The priest says his offices in the small grey church, and its bell divides the day into its gentle thirds. When a household brews a fresh batch of ale, they tie a green bush to a pole above the door, and the street knows, without a word, where to gather that evening. These are the early 1340s, and the harvests have been kind for some years now. The granaries hold, the tithe barn fills, the children are growing tall. Nobody here has heard of Pelusium or Constantinople. The wide world reaches this street as peddlers' ribbons and market day rumours, and even those arrive comfortably out of date. History, for now, is somewhere else. And this village would be quite content on the whole, for history to remain a thing that happens to other people. We know, walking beside them with our small lamp, that in a handful of years a hard season will come up the roads from the sea, harder than any remembered. But that is not tonight's worry, and it was not theirs either. What the village has and what Agnes has is this: the fields greening, the fire kept, the garden coming on. And the best way to understand what carried people through what was coming is simply to spend one whole ordinary day in it, from the first raked ember to the last banked coal. So let the mist finish rising off the stream, let the pigeon carry on with its endless sentence, and let us begin at the beginning, in the dark before dawn beside her hearth. The cottage is black dark and quiet when Agnes wakes, and she wakes the way she always does, a little before she needs to, as though some small bell rings inside her. She lies still for a moment under the wool listening. The rain has stopped. The cow is shifting in the byre, her husband is asleep and will be for another hour. Then she's up, feet finding the cold floor and kneeling at the hearth, where last night's fire waits under its clay cover like a secret kept overnight. She lifts the cover, rakes the ash aside, and there they are, the embers, still pulsing a deep orange, and she feeds them dry twigs and leans down and breathes them into flame. It is the first small victory of every medieval day, fire carried alive across a night, and she does it without ceremony, the way you might wind a clock. Water next, from the well by the gate, 2 buckets on a yoke. The rope is cold in her hands, and first light is just greying the thatch across the street. The pottage pot goes onto its hook over the fire, yesterday's pottage, for pottage is less a meal than a continuing story, added to daily, never quite finished. This morning she adds a handful of oats, a leek from the garden chopped small, and a few careful shavings from the bacon in the rafters, because today is market day. While it warms, she lets out the hens, who exit their coop like scandalised dowagers, and scatters barley for them, and finds 2 eggs, still warm, which go gently into the basket. She milks the cow into a wooden pail, leaning her forehead against the warm flank, and the sound of milk on wood is one of the oldest quiet rhythms in the world. By full light, her husband is away to the fields with the plough team, and Agnes breaks her fast standing up, maslin bread, rye and wheat together, and a cup of ale. Ale with breakfast sounds indulgent until you remember that everyone drinks it, children included, brewed weak and fresh. It is simply what water becomes when a village wants to trust it. Agnes brews her own every week or so, malting the barley, steeping it in the big crock, and her ale has a certain reputation, which she pretends not to know about. The morning goes to the garden, weeding between the bean rows while a blackbird supervises from the fence, and to the dough she sets to prove beneath a cloth by the hearth. And through every gap in the work, without seeming to think about it, she spins. The distaff rides in the crook of her left arm, the spindle drops and twirls at her knee. Wool becomes thread while she walks, while she talks over the fence, while she waits for the pot. A woman's hands in this century are very rarely still, and thread is the reason. At mid-morning she walks to market in the town, 3 miles by the field path, the basket on her hip holding eggs, a round cheese, and 2 hens sold on ahead by promise. The path runs along the strips where the men are harrowing, and everyone she passes gets a word or a nod, ranked precisely according to the village's own invisible order of affection. The market town is one wide street of stalls under awnings, smelling of fish, bread, and the peppery dust of the spice seller's table, which she visits only with her eyes. Pepper costs more than she cares to say aloud. She prices it every market day anyway, on principle, the way one keeps up with a distinguished acquaintance. She sells her eggs and cheese for silver pennies, small and thin, and buys salt, a paper of needles, and a ribbon the colour of holly berries, after negotiations of real seriousness. News is traded as briskly as goods here. Who is to marry, what the wool is fetching, what the King's War in France may mean for taxes, which is to say, nothing good. Then the 3 miles home again, spinning as she goes, the spindle keeping time with her steps, and the afternoon settles into baking and churning, and the 100 small motions of keeping. The loaves bake on the hearthstone under an upturned pot heaped with embers, and the cottage fills with the smell that has meant safety to human beings for 10,000 years. The church bell rings the hours over the fields, prime and noon and evensong, and nobody owns an hourglass and nobody needs one. The day keeps itself if you live inside it properly. Her husband comes in at dusk with mud to the knee, and the news of the plough, which is the same news as yesterday, delivered with the same satisfaction. Supper is the pottage, thick now and savoury with its whisper of bacon, new bread, a wedge of cheese and Agnes's ale drunk from wooden cups by firelight. They eat mostly in the good silence of tired people, with the hens murmuring outside and the fire ticking, and the new ribbon lying on the table being quietly admired. After supper the neighbours drift in for an hour, as they often do, to share the light of one fire instead of burning two, the women spinning, the men mending a harness strap. There are stories, the comfortable kind that everyone already knows, and a little singing, low and unhurried, and the fire does most of the listening. This is the rhythm, and it is worth feeling the whole weight and worth of it. Fire, water, bread, beasts, field, market, supper, neighbours, sleep. It has repeated with small variations for as long as anyone's grandmother's grandmother could remember, and it is precisely this, not walls or armies, that the coming years will test. And here is the quiet truth this whole night keeps returning to: the rhythm will bend in the hard years ahead, but it will not break. Someone will always rake the embers. When the neighbours have gone, Agnes covers the fire with its clay curfew, tucking the day's last embers in for the night, exactly as her mother did, and hers before that. She stands a moment in the doorway before the latch drops, looking down the sleeping street where the last smoke stands straight up from the roofs into a sky full of stars. At the market today there was a scrap of stray talk she's already half forgotten. A sailor's tale, third hand at best, of a sickness somewhere far beyond the sea. Traders' stories are half-wind, everyone knows that, and the sea is very wide, and the harvest is coming on well, and her own roof is sound. Still, the tale will come again, nearer each time, carried along the roads the way all news comes, no faster than a walking horse, and that is where we will walk tomorrow. For now the latch drops, the curfew keeps its embers, and Agnes sleeps, in the middle of an ordinary night, in the last of the ordinary years. The rumour reaches the village the way rumours always do, riding in someone's saddlebag, folded in among the ordinary news. It arrives on a market evening, at the inn beside the green, where a wool merchant up from the south is drying his boots at the fire. You are there too, near the door, in the good smell of ale and wood smoke, listening the way the whole room is listening, sideways without quite seeming to. The merchant is talking about a sickness. Far away, he says. In the east, beyond Venice, beyond the edge of any map a person in this room has ever seen. A great mortality, he says, travelling with the trading ships. He had the story from a spice dealer, who had it from a sailor, who heard it in a port whose name has already gone soft from handling. The fire settles. Someone fills his cup again, and the talk drifts on, as talk does, to wool prices and this endless summer rain. But the story is true, or something close to true. The better part of a year behind that merchant's tale, in October of 1347, 12 Genoese galleys came gliding into the harbour of Messina, in Sicily, riding low in the water, home from the Black Sea trade. A friar named Michel de Piazza later wrote down what happened next in a careful, sorrowful hand. The sailors aboard were ill. The townspeople took fright and ordered the ships back out of the harbour, and it was already too late because the sickness had quietly stepped ashore ahead of the order. That is how the great pestilence entered Europe, not with thunder, but with mooring ropes and unloaded cargo, and tired men who only wanted to be home. And then it travelled, the way everything travelled in the 14th century, along the same roads and sea lanes as wool and wine and letters. Overland, the pestilence moved at a slow walk, a mile or two in a day, slower than a walking horse. You could in principle have strolled ahead of it, and some people quietly did. But at sea it rode the ships, and the ships were fast. Genoa and Marseille by the turn of winter. Venice and Pisa in the new year of 1348. Avignon, the city of the popes, in the spring. Paris in the summer heat. And running just ahead of it the whole way. Like the bow wave before a boat, went the rumour. Carried by carters and chapmen, pilgrims and friars, each retelling placing the sickness one town nearer than the telling before. Here in the village the news arrives in that soft second-hand form all through the spring and early summer of 1348. Agnes hears it the way you do, in pieces. A peddler selling ribbons and needles says Paris has it now. A grey friar preaching at the market cross asks for prayers for the dead of Avignon. And in August, word comes down from the bishop himself. Ralph of Shrewsbury, Bishop of Bath and Wells, has sent letters through every parish in his care, asking for processions and psalms each Friday because a grievous pestilence, he writes, has come out of the east into a neighbouring kingdom. A neighbouring kingdom. France, that means. One narrow stripe of grey water away. The village takes this in at its own pace, which is the pace of a place that has heard alarming news before. Of wars, of famines, of new taxes, and has learned that most of it arrives smaller than its rumour, and besides, it is harvest. Whatever is or is not happening across the water, the wheat is standing in the fields, and the summer of 1348 has been the wettest that anyone can remember. Rain upon rain since midsummer. The kind of year when the grain wants to sprout in the ear, and every dry morning is a gift that must not be wasted. So the village does what villages have always done. Everyone who can hold a sickle is out at first light, moving down the strips in a slow line, and Agnes is among them, cutting and gathering in a rhythm older than the church tower, while behind the reapers the sheaves are bound and stood together in stooks like small golden tents. Behind them all come the gleaners, the widows and the children, gathering the fallen ears by ancient right, because in this village even the spilled grain belongs to someone. It is worth sitting with for a moment, this picture. A whole community that has heard the rumour and still binds its sheaves, still stacks its stooks, still sings the old harvest songs at dusk over a shared jug of ale. Bringing in a harvest is an act of faith in the months to come, and they bring it in anyway, every soggy sheaf of it. In the evenings at the inn the talk is a little quieter than it used to be. The merchants' tales keep stepping closer. Rouen, someone says, the ports of Normandy, a ship seen waiting off the coast, no one aboard willing to say from where. The priest holds his Friday processions as the bishop asked, the whole parish walking slowly around the churchyard through wet grass, saying the psalms, and there is a particular comfort in it. Everyone's voice pitched low, everyone's shoes darkening with dew, doing the one thing that can be done together. And then, in the last warm days of that dripping summer, a carter brings word that is not second-hand anymore. A port town to the southwest, Melcombe, on the Dorset coast, where the Gascon wine ships come in. A vessel arrived, they say, with sickness aboard, sometime around midsummer, and now the town itself is stricken. People stop saying abroad. The pestilence is in England, at the far end of long roads, in a place most villagers have never seen. But under the same reign, in the same kingdom, on the same map. That night Agnes banks the fire as she always does, and stands for a moment in the doorway, listening to the water dripping from the thatch. The harvest will go on tomorrow, because it must. But from this evening, the village is listening differently, beginning quietly to think about what a household does when a story stops being a story and starts walking up the road. What a household does, it turns out, looks less like fear than like housekeeping. Through the autumn of 1348 and into the cold opening of 1349, the news keeps arriving in its patient, plodding way, and each time it names somewhere a little nearer. Bristol, they say, by late summer, the sickness carried up the busy wine roads. In October, another bishop, William Eddington of Winchester, writes to his parishes of a cruel pestilence that has reached the coasts of the realm, and asks his people for prayers and for patience and for penitence walked out slowly in procession. The towns try what towns can think of to try. There is a story told for years afterward that the men of Gloucester shut their gates against travellers from stricken Bristol, hoping distance alone might keep them safe. It did not work in the end. Almost nothing anyone tried that year quite worked. But it is worth pausing over that instinct, because inside it is something recognisably modern. The first fumbling grasp at the idea that space and time between people might slow a sickness down. The right idea, arriving about 3 centuries early, wearing medieval clothes. In the village, the shape of the worry is smaller and more particular. It gathers, of all places, at the manor court, that slow, familiar institution where the business of the village has always been recorded. You can stand at the back of the manor hall on court day and watch it happen. The Lord Steward at the table, the clerk beside him with his quills and his long roll of parchment, the tenants on the benches in their work clothes smelling of wood smoke and wet wool. The court has always dealt in ordinary things, strayed pigs and unpaid pence, and mostly it still does. But now the clerk's entries have begun to change. When a tenant of the manor dies, the roll records it, along with the heriot, the old custom by which the family renders the best beast in the yard to the lord, 1 cow or 1 ox before a son or a widow can take up the land. In an ordinary year, the clerk writes such entries a handful of times. In the year that is coming, in villages all across England, those tidy Latin lines will multiply down the parchment, roll after roll, until some courts simply do not meet for a season, the clerks setting down their quills and waiting like everyone else for spring. Historians still read those rolls today, and what strikes them is not drama but steadiness. The same careful hand, the same formulas, the village writing itself down all the way through, but that is ahead. For now, in Agnes's cottage, preparation looks like this. It looks like herbs cut from the garden on the last dry days and hung in bunches from the rafter over the hearth. Sage and rue, rosemary and thyme, and grey-leaved wormwood, which is held to be good against corrupted air and is at the very least good against moths. It looks like counting on a quiet evening everything the household holds. The sack of oats and the smaller sacks of dried beans and peas that will thicken the winter's pottage, the flitch of bacon in its salt up out of reach, 2 cheeses wrapped in cloth, a pot of honey, the ale freshly brewed, the verjuice and the vinegar jug in their corner sharp and dependable. It looks like firewood, stacked to the eaves of the lean-to and covered against the rain, and a winter's worth of rushlights dipped in tallow, laid by in a dry box like thin green candles, each one an hour of light against a long night. None of this is panic. Most of it is simply what a careful household does before any winter. But this year Agnes counts it twice, and adds a little where she can. And you can feel the difference in the way her hands move. Not hurried, just deliberate. The way you check the latch on a night when the wind is rising. What nobody in the village can do is name the thing itself. The learned men have tried. In Paris, the masters of the university, asked by the king himself, have written a grave report explaining that the trouble began with a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius, 3 years past, which corrupted the air of the world. Most people in the village have never heard of the report, but they have absorbed its everyday version, that the sickness rides in bad air, in mists and southern winds and evil smells, and that sweet smoke and clean smells are a kind of armour. Others say, more simply, that heaven is sorrowful, and that the remedy is prayer, and patience, and mending one's ways. What no one says, because no one on earth yet knows it, is anything about the black rats in the granaries, or the small fleas they carry. That answer is real, and it is walking the same roads as the rumour, and it will not be found for another 5.5 centuries. The village is doing what people always do when the cause is hidden, tending everything that can be tended and praying about the rest. And so the quiet resolve of that winter is not a grand thing. It is Agnes going over the thatch with her eyes on a still morning. It is the hens shut in early, the garden dug, the water crock kept full. It is neighbours talking over the fence a little longer than usual, taking a kind of inventory of one another, who is old, who is alone, who has small children who would need looking in on. Preparation, in the end, mostly means making a house ready to care for whoever will need caring for, and there is one more errand in it too. On the next dry market day, Agnes puts on her cloak, takes her basket and a few saved pennies, and walks the road to the market town, because along one of its narrow streets, under a painted sign, there is a shop that deals in exactly the kind of small comforts a careful household might want on its shelf this year, and it smells like every good thing at once. The apothecary's shop announces itself before you reach it. Halfway down the narrow street, threading between puddles, you catch the first warm edge of it on the air. Cloves and beeswax, dried rose petals, something green and resinous underneath, and by the time Agnes ducks under the low lintel, the smell has become a whole climate. Inside, the shop is hardly bigger than a pantry, and every inch of it is working. Shelves climb the walls, crowded with glazed jars and little earthenware pots, each one labelled in a crabbed hand or marked with a painted sign. Bunches of dried herbs hang from the ceiling beams like a garden put away for winter. On the counter sit the brass scales with their nested weights, polished bright by years of careful thumbs, and behind them the great bronze mortar, big as a bucket, whose pestle rings softly against the rim as the apothecary works. He is a deliberate man, this apothecary, a member of the Spicers' Guild, and his trade runs from pepper and ginger and sugar loaves wrapped in blue paper at one end, to wax candles and ink at the other, with all the remedies of the age ranged in between, and in this particular year the remedies are what people come for. The grandest of them all sits in a stoneware jar on the highest shelf, and it is called theriac, or, as everyone actually says, treacle. Theriac is less a medicine than an heirloom. It is a thick, dark electuary compounded from dozens of ingredients, honey and spices and rare gums and things a village customer would not recognise by name, aged like a fine cheese, and the lore insists that a good Theriac should be years old before it is trusted. The most famous comes all the way from Venice, and a little of it costs more than a labourer sees in a week. Physicians will write, in the plague tracts that copy from one another for a century, that a portion of old treacle taken in warm ale is a sovereign defence. Whether it defends anyone is a question the 14th century cannot answer, but it is sweet and warming, and taking it feels like doing something, which in a frightened season is itself a kind of medicine. For those with lighter purses there are the pomanders, smell apples people call them, and the name is exactly right. The wealthy carry them in little pierced cases of silver or gilt, packed with ambergris and musk and camphor, worn at the girdle so that a turn of the wrist brings sweetness to the nose. But a pomander can be humbler than that and still be loved. An orange stuck all over with cloves drying slowly into something hard and fragrant. A ball of rose petals and spices bound in a scrap of linen. Agnes turns one of the clove oranges in her fingers, and the smell that rises from it is Christmas and summer at once. Beside them, the apothecary keeps his vinegars and his rosewater, and these are the workhorses of the whole shelf. Wash your hands and face with vinegar and rosewater. The advice runs, morning and evening, wipe what comes into the house, carry a small sponge soaked in vinegar to hold to your nose in a crowd. Long after the Theriac jar is empty, households will still be reaching for the vinegar, and they will not be entirely wrong to. All of it, the sweetness, the smoke, the sharpness, flows from the one great belief of the age, which is that pestilence rides in corrupted air. Miasma, the physicians call it. If bad air is the enemy, then good air is the shield, and so the age defends itself with smell. Keep the windows shuttered against the south wind. Burn juniper and rosemary and bay on the hearth, so the smoke walks through the house like a watchman. Strew sweet herbs on the floor. In Avignon, it is said, the Pope himself, Clement VI, has been advised by his physicians to sit between two great fires all through the summer, and he does, and he stays well. And here is a small, quiet irony that nobody alive can see, because the heat of those fires very likely did help. By keeping away the one tiny creature actually responsible, for reasons no one would understand for centuries. Sometimes the wrong theory builds the right room. The tracts have gentler advice too, and it is easy to smile at and easier to be touched by. Rest, they say, eat moderately, of simple food. Avoid heavy exertion and crowded places, and above all, avoid sorrow and fear and heavy thoughts, for despair opens the body to illness. Seek out cheerful company, pleasant tales, sweet music. There is something rather tender about a century's best doctors solemnly prescribing cheerfulness, on doctor's orders, in the very season it was hardest to come by. And yet, sitting quietly inside all this, inside the treacle and the smell apples and the prescribed good cheer, are the things that genuinely helped, the ones that never needed a theory. Rest, warmth, clean linen changed and washed, broth and small ale taken in patient spoonfuls, and someone willing to bring them to you, hour after hour, which is the one remedy on nobody's shelf and at the bottom of every recovery. The medieval sick room at its best got most of that right, not because the book said so, but because mothers and neighbours already knew it. Agnes makes her small purchases, a measure of cloves, a phial of rosewater, a pennyworth of dried herbs she cannot grow. And the apothecary wraps them with the unhurried neatness of a man who believes in his stock. Then she steps out into the grey street, her basket a little heavier and a little sweeter, and turns for home. She cannot know precisely when the things in that basket will be wanted. She only knows, the way everyone now knows, that the road the rumour travelled is a real road, and that it runs, eventually, to the end of every village lane, even a quiet one, even hers. And when the sickness finally does come walking up it, what will matter most is not what sits on any shelf. It is who is willing to open the door and sit down beside the bed. When the sickness does come to the village, in the raw weeks of that turning year, it does not come the way the stories said it would. It comes quietly, house by house, the way frost comes. One cottage, then a pause, then another, further down the lane. And almost at once, before anyone has decided anything, the village settles into the oldest arrangement in the world, the one that needs no meeting and no announcement, Some people are sick, and some people are tending. And everything now moves around that fact softly, like water around a stone. Tending in this century is an art that lives mostly in women's hands, passed from mother to daughter along with the bread recipe and the mending stitch. It looks like this. The fire is kept in day and night, because a sick room must never go cold. A cloth is wrung out in cool water and laid on a hot forehead, and changed again, with a patience that does not count the changes. Broth is always on the hearth, a hen boiled down soft with barley, or the everyday pottage thinned to something a weak throat can manage, and it is offered in small spoonfuls, without hurry, because getting half a cup of warm broth into a fevered neighbour over the course of an hour is counted a victory, and it is one. There is posset, hot milk curdled gently with ale, which is what this age gives the ailing by way of comfort in a cup. There is small ale for thirst, sip by sip. There is clean straw for the bedding, and linen changed and boiled and dried by the fire until the whole room smells of washing rather than illness. And there is the watching, someone sitting up through the dark hours on a stool by the bed, a rushlight burning, listening to the breathing, feeding the fire, being there. The tenders called it keeping watch, and the words have kept that meaning ever since. Agnes is one of the tenders. Perhaps you already guessed she would be. In the grey of the morning you can see her going down the lane with a covered crock of broth held against her hip. Her breath showing in the cold air, stepping around the puddles she has known the location of her whole life. She sits the night watch in a neighbour's cottage, spinning a little wool by feel in the near dark to keep herself wakeful, the spindle turning slow at the end of its thread. She washes linen until her knuckles are red, and spreads it on the hedge when there is sun, and by the fire when there is not. She feeds the hens of a household too weary to feed anything, and milks the cow of a shut house, leaving the pail on the step. None of it is heroic in any way she would recognise. It is just what is next, done steadily, one small task at a time, and this, far more than anything in any jar, is what survival actually looked like. Something else is noticed in these weeks, the same discovery the Athenians had made 17 centuries earlier. Watching their own recovered rise from their beds unafraid, those who come through the sickness do not as a rule sicken twice. Nobody can say why. But the recovered become the village's steadiest hands, carrying water where others hesitate, sitting with the worst of the fevers, walking between houses with a freedom the healthy no longer feel they have. To be recovered is, in these weeks, almost an office, and recovery itself is given room which is worth sitting with for a moment. Historians reading the manor rolls of a Huntingdonshire village found that those who survived that year were commonly excused their duties for something like 3 months, while their strength came back, the record itself pausing line after line to let people mend. Even the paperwork that year learned patience. Around the sick rooms, the rest of the village arranges itself into an economy of quiet kindness. Bread is left on doorsteps wrapped in a cloth, still warm by someone who does not knock. A jug of milk stands on a gatepost at dawn, and is taken in, and the empty jug stands there again by evening, which is its own kind of message. Still here, still managing, thank you. Firewood appears over a fence. A child from a shut-in household is fed at another family's board without a word being made of it, and somebody's dog is suddenly sleeping at somebody else's hearth. Little of this is written down anywhere, because nobody thought it remarkable. It is only remarkable from here, at 600 years' distance, this picture of a frightened community deciding, one loaf at a time, to stay a community. And there is loss in these weeks. It would be wrong to pretend otherwise, and the village does not pretend. Some mornings, a cottage that should have smoke rising from its thatch has none, and the lane understands and grows quiet, and the neighbours take their hats off in their doorways. But notice how this century holds such mornings, not with panic and not with looking away, but with custom, with candles carried, and doors shut gently, and the old words said, and the small dignified processions to the churchyard at the day's soft end. Grief here has a shape and a schedule and a place to be put down, and that is a mercy that this age, for all it lacked, possessed in abundance. Above all of it, through all of it, there is the bell. The church bell has marked every day of Agnes's life, work and rest, feast and fast. And now it marks these days too, tolling slow and even from the tower, a sound that rolls out over the wet fields like something laid down to comfort them. When it rings, the tenders pause with their spoons in their hands, and the reapers of last summer stand still in their doorways, and the whole village, sick and well together, is gathered for a moment into one listening. The bell knows what to do, people say, And perhaps that is the truest thing said all year. Because up the lane, past the gatepost with its milk jug, the church door is standing open, and there are candles lit inside, and that is where the village is quietly carrying everything it cannot carry alone. And when the last bowl of broth has been carried, when the bread has been left on its quiet doorstep, there is one place in the village that stays awake with you. The church has stood at the centre of things for longer than anyone can remember. Its stones hold the cold of winter and the cool of summer in the same patient way. And in this strange year it has become something closer to a lantern, a place where the village keeps a small light burning, no matter what the day has brought. You hear it first in the bells. Every village lives by its bell. They call the morning, they mark the noon, they gather people in from the fields. But there is one bell with a particular voice, and everyone knows it. It is called the passing bell, and it rings while someone is slipping gently from this world, so that neighbours everywhere, at the hearth, at the well, bent over the washing, can pause and stand still for a moment, and send a quiet prayer along the lane like a lamp being passed from hand to hand. There is even a small code in the tolling, counted in slow strokes they call tellers, 3 times 3 for a man, 3 times 2 for a woman, fewer for a child. No words are needed. The whole village understands, and the whole village, for one held breath, keeps company with a single house. Some evenings you see the priest making his rounds. He is a tired man, and a faithful one, and he walks the lanes with a boy going before him carrying a lantern and a little handbell that gives a bright silver chime in the dusk. The priest carries something precious wrapped close against his chest, and when the small bell sounds, people come to their doorways and kneel in the soft mud, heads bowed, until he is past. It is a procession of 2, a boy, a lamp, a bell, an old man in a worn dark robe, and yet it settles the street like a hand smoothing a blanket. Inside the sick house he speaks the old comforting words, touches blessed oil to brow and hands, and sets a lit candle where tired eyes can rest on it. Whatever else this year has taken, it has not taken this, that no one need face the dark without a light, and a voice, and a hand holding theirs. Here is a small, true kindness worth sitting with for a moment. In the January of this hard year, the Bishop of Bath and Wells sent a letter through his parishes because so many priests were sick themselves that some villages had no one to hear a dying person's last words. If no priest can come, the bishop wrote, then let the dying make their confession to anyone at all, to a friend, to a neighbour, even, he said, to a woman. In that world that was an astonishing thing to put in writing. It meant that the whole solemn machinery of the church could, when it mattered most, be folded down into something the size of 2 chairs drawn close together and a listening ear. And far away in Avignon, the Pope himself declared that all who died of the pestilence were forgiven everything, a blanket of mercy thrown wide over the whole of Christendom, so that no one need be afraid. Step inside the church itself in the blue hour after supper and you find it glowing. Candles stand before the saints in little constellations, honest tallow from the cottages, and here and there a true beeswax candle, sweet-smelling, given by someone who could barely spare it. Agnes comes most evenings. She lights a candle for each name she's minding, and she stands with her beads of worn boxwood moving slowly through her fingers. And the old psalms drift from the chancel, out of the depths have I called, in the unhurried voice of a priest who has sung them 10,000 times. The words are Latin, and most of the village understands almost none of them, and that hardly matters at all. What they understand is the tune, and the warmth, and the fact of the singing, that the same phrases their grandparents leaned on are still holding the roof up tonight. Out in the churchyard, in the last light, the sexton is at his quiet work. He's not a grim figure, whatever the storybooks may say later. He is a village man with a spade and a steady heart, and he treats every task like the laying of a hearth fire, carefully, respectfully, in good order. Graves are set facing east, toward the sunrise, because that is the direction hope comes from. The old yew tree stands over everything, dark green and patient, as it has for 300 years. Neighbours carry the parish beer together, friends at each corner, and the linen is clean, and the psalms are said. And afterwards there is always someone waiting at a cottage door with ale and bread, because grief in a village is never carried alone. It is passed around like a heavy basket, so that no one pair of arms has to hold it long. And this, perhaps, is the secret the bells have been keeping all along. Ritual is a kind of tending too. The candle, the knell, the murmured psalm, they are broth for a different kind of hunger. They take the largest thing a person can feel and give it a shape small enough to hold. A flame, a bead, 9 slow strokes of bronze in the evening air. The village grieves, but it grieves together, and in order, and out loud, and that makes all the difference between drowning and swimming slowly to shore. Yet not everyone chooses to stay and swim. Standing by the churchyard wall at dusk, you can see the road that runs way over the hill toward the towns. And lately that road has been busier than usual, with laden carts and hurrying riders. Some people, when the bells begin, decide their best hope lies elsewhere, and where they go and what becomes of them, and who quietly remains. That is its own story waiting just up the road. So come and stand a while by that road in the early morning and watch who passes. It is not a stampede. Nothing in this village ever quite manages to be a stampede, but it is steady. A merchant's cart piled with chests and feather beds, a birdcage swinging from the tailboard, a pair of riders in good grey cloaks moving faster than the lane really allows, a family on foot with a handcart and a goat on a rope, the children looking back over their shoulders at the only church tower they have ever known. The physicians of the age had a saying for it. 3 brisk Latin words that boiled down to this: leave quickly, go far, and come back slowly. Those who could afford to follow that advice followed it. Most people could not, and so the road stays a thin stream rather than a river, but a stream is enough to change the feel of a place. Up at the manor house, the change shows first. The lord and his family have gone to another of their estates, somewhere upland and out of the way, taking the plate and the best horses and half the servants. The great hall stands shuttered. The manor court, which usually meets under the old oak to settle the village's small disputes, a strayed pig, a moved boundary stone, has simply not been called. And in the fields you can see the strangest sight of this whole strange year, the harvest, standing. Good barley, heavy-headed and golden brown, leaning in the wind with nobody to cut it. A chronicler up in Leicester, a canon called Henry Knighton, wrote down what he saw that season, and it reads like a dream. Sheep and cattle wandering loose through the standing corn, drifting over the land with no one to drive them, crops quietly going back into the ground they came from. The animals at least seem untroubled. They graze the headlands and doze in the ditches and wait, as animals do, for the people to sort themselves out. And here, if you will allow it, is a gentle look at the most famous leave-taking of them all, because far away in Florence, in this very stretch of years, something rather lovely was made out of flight. A writer named Giovanni Boccaccio imagined it, and perhaps half remembered it. 7 young women and 3 young men, meeting by chance in a quiet church, and agreeing together to walk out of the troubled city into the hills toward Fiesole, to a villa with a walled garden, a fountain, and cool rooms smelling of rosemary. And there, instead of brooding, they made themselves a small kingdom of good order. Each day they crowned one of their company king or queen with a wreath of laurel leaves, and each day, in the shade by the fountain, every one of them told a story, merry ones, wise ones, foolish ones, 100 stories in all before they were done. In the evenings there was supper and singing and a slow round dance on the lawn. Boccaccio opened his book with words worth keeping in a pocket. It is human, he wrote, to have compassion for those who suffer. His storytellers were running away, yes, but what they built in that garden was the same thing the village builds with its bells and its broth. A shape to hold the day steady. A story told aloud at dusk, it turns out, is one more kind of medicine. Back in the village, Agnes has heard the road too, and has made her own quiet arithmetic about it. She has an elderly neighbour who cannot travel, a garden coming ripe, hens who know her step, a cow in milk, and 6 households who have come to rely on the sound of her knock. Set against all that, the road over the hill weighs very little, so she stays. There is no speech about it, no moment of decision by the gate with music swelling. Just a woman banking her fire at night and raking it open again in the morning, which is what staying actually looks like. And she is not alone. The smith stays, because forgers do not travel. The miller stays with his millstones, the priest with his parish, the sexton with his spade, the alewife with her brewing tubs. Between them, without ever calling it anything, they keep the village a living place. Bread still baked, milk still drawn, ale still poured, doors still answered. It is worth being honest, softly, about how it fell out. Fleeing helped some and failed others. The sickness rode in carts and saddlebags as easily as it walked lanes, and more than one fine household found that distance was not the fortress it appeared. Staying too was no charm. but the ones who stayed gave each other something the road could never give, a warm hand within calling distance. And historians, reading the old manor rolls all these centuries later, still notice with a kind of wonder how stubbornly the ordinary work went on. Entries in careful brown ink for ale brewed, for bread acised, for a strayed heifer returned to its owner, in the very worst months of the very worst year. The clerks kept writing, the ovens kept warming, somebody every single day fed the hens. By Michaelmas the road has gone quiet again. Those who meant to go have gone, those who remain have turned back to the fields, salvaging what harvest they can in small determined bands. Women and old men and half-grown boys working side by side, sharing bread at the headland at noon, cleaning right down to the last drop deer, because this winter, of all winters, nothing will be wasted. The evenings are drawing in. There is a new coolness in the air at dusk, a smell of wet leaves and wood smoke, and the first white breath of frost on the morning grass. The village, tired in its bones, finds itself almost glad of it. Because cold, the old people say, is clean. And this year everyone is waiting to see whether winter, slow, silent, ordinary winter, might turn out to be the kindest visitor of all. And winter, when it comes the way it always has. First as a whitening of the morning grass, then as ice in the water pail. Then as a deep blue stillness that settles over the whole valley like a second sky. The ponds harden at their edges. The lanes freeze into ridges that hold a boot print for a week. Smoke rises from the cottage chimneys in straight, unhurried columns, and the village pulls itself in close around its fires as it does every year. Except that this year, the pulling in feels different. It feels like shelter in more ways than one, because as the frost deepens, something is quietly happening that nobody dares to say aloud just yet. The sickness is ebbing. You notice it the way the village notices everything. By ear. The passing bell, which through the autumn rang so often that people had almost stopped lifting their heads, begins to fall silent for a day at a time, then 2 days, then most of a week. Nobody understands why. The learned men will talk of frost cleansing the air, and it will be centuries before anyone thinks about the small sleeping creatures of the cold months and puts the true story together. The village does not need the reason. It needs the silence. And it drinks the silence in like warm milk. Agnes catches herself one grey afternoon standing stock still in the yard with a hen under her arm, listening, and hearing nothing at all but wind in the bare hedge and the far-off knock of somebody splitting wood. She stands there for the better part of a minute, letting the nothing pour over her. It is, she thinks, the most beautiful sound she has ever heard. Indoors, the season keeps its old comforts, and they have never been more welcome. There is salted pork in the barrel and onions in their plats along the beam. There are apples wrinkling sweetly in the loft, and a pot of peas pottage that never quite leaves the fire, only thickens and mellows and gets stirred back to life each day. The evenings are long and dark, and people fill them the way their grandparents did, spinning by firelight, mending harness, telling the old stories, falling asleep in the middle of them. Neighbours who tended each other through the worst months now sit at each other's hearths through the easy ones, cracking hazelnuts and saying not very much. Some things do not need saying. A shared silence beside a fire between people who have carried heavy baskets together is its own kind of conversation. There is a counting that happens in a winter like this, gentle and unspoken. At Mass on Sundays, eyes travel along the benches, noting who is there. The village has grown smaller, of that there is no doubt. In some parishes 1/3 of the names are gone from the rolls. In some nearly half, and yet a few villages over the hill, for reasons no one could ever fathom, were scarcely touched at all. Historians still wonder at that unevenness softly without ever settling it. But the counting turns up quiet marvels too. Faces that were grey and hollow at All Saints are pink again by Christmas. The recovered walks slowly at first, wrapped well, taking the air on a neighbour's arm a little further each day, forgetting better the old records show, was its own long season, measured in weeks of broth and rest and being fussed over. The village gives its convalescents the sunniest doorsteps and the first of everything, and watches them refill like drawn wells. At Candlemas, at the dark tale of winter, the whole parish comes to church carrying candles, as it does every 2nd of February, to have the year's light blessed. The nave fills with small flames, dozens upon dozens of them, one in every pair of hands trembling slightly in the draught from the door, and the priest, thinner than last year but still here, moves down the aisle through his own constellation. Nobody preaches about what the village has been through. Nobody needs to. The candles say it. Still here, still here, still here, in a soft, crackling chorus. And then comes a morning in early spring when the frost relents, and the reeve. A new reeve, a younger man stepping into shoes that were left empty or a cries the first market day. It is a small affair, and it is completely wonderful. Trestles go up in the churchyard lee. There are eggs and winter cabbages, a bolt of homespun cloth, skeins of wool, a man with 3 piglets in a wicker crate, the alewife's bench with her ale stake freshly garlanded. People come as much to look at each other as to buy. They stand about in the pale sunshine shaking hands, actually shaking hands, holding on a half moment longer than the greeting strictly requires. The alewife declares that her first brew of the year is her best in a decade, and everyone agrees, and it's entirely possible that everyone is simply glad to be standing in a crowd again, tasting anything at all. These are the small mercies the winter leaves behind, and the village gathers them the way it gleaned the autumn fields, right down to the last one. A bell that rings only for the hours, a market cross with people leaning on it, gossiping, a row of convalescents on sunny benches, complaining cheerfully about being fussed over. Green shoots in Agnes's garden, exactly where green shoots ought to be. None of it is loud, all of it is survival, wearing its ordinary working clothes, and underneath the relief, something else is stirring that no one has words for yet. The world on the far side of this winter is not going to be quite the same world. You can feel it already in the market day talk, in the number of empty holdings, in the way a Lord Steward now speaks to a ploughman almost politely. Spring is coming, the fields are waiting, and there are fewer hands to work them than there have ever been in living memory. What that will mean, for wages, for land, for Agnes's table, is the next quiet turn of the story, and a gentler one than anyone dares to hope. And that turn begins, of all places, at the hiring. When haymaking comes round again, the steward walks out to the meadow expecting to pay what stewards have always paid. A couple of pennies a day and a plain noon meal, and finds, to his lasting astonishment, that the mowers have opinions. There are half as many scythes in the county as there were 2 summers ago, and every one of them knows it. A reaper who once took 2 pence now asks 4 or 5, and gets it, with his dinner and his ale thrown in, because the hay will not wait and the barley will not wait, and over the hill there is another steward offering more, for the first time in anyone's memory. The people who do the work hold the better cards, and they play them, not fiercely, just firmly, the way you state the price of eggs. The great men, it must be said, did not take this quietly. Word comes up the road from Westminster of a royal ordinance, and later a full statute, commanding that wages be pegged to what they were before the pestilence, that workers must take work at the old rates, that no employer may offer more. It is read out solemnly at the market cross. The village listens with perfectly straight faces, and then everyone goes home, and the harvest comes, and the steward, who has fields on one side of the law and weather on the other, quietly pays what the work is worth, perhaps entering it in the roll under some inventive heading. The lawmakers push, the ploughmen lean, and over the years the leaning wins. Some historians look back on the century that follows and call it the golden age of the English labourer, which would have made the labourers themselves laugh, but they would have laughed over wheat bread and a second helping of bacon, which is rather the point. Land is moving too, in the patient way land moves. Holdings that fell empty are taken up by survivors, a strip here, a croft there, an orchard that a man's uncle once envied across the hedge. Entry fines come down because a lord with vacant land is a lord in a mood to be reasonable. Old labour dues, the boon days of ploughing and carting owed to the manor, begin, quietly, to be paid off in coin instead, and each such bargain loosens. By one small notch, bonds that had held for 300 years. Nobody calls it a new world. It is just a better field, a lower rent, a door that now has its own name on it, so to speak. That is how large history mostly arrives, dressed as a slightly better arrangement. And people marry. My, how they marry. The church porch is busy all that year and the next, widows and widowers joining households and hearths. Young people wedding earlier than their parents did because there is suddenly land to wed onto. Cradles fill. The village school of gossip has never had richer material. Agnes, who buried griefs of her own and tended half the parish through the dark months, stands at more than one wedding with rosemary pinned to her kerchief and cries the small, easy tears that are mostly gladness, and afterwards dances, carefully laughing in the way of a woman who has remembered that her feet can do other things than hurry. Step into her cottage on an ordinary evening a few years on, and you can measure the change with your eyes shut. The pottage is thick with bacon. Not just the memory of bacon. The loaf on the board is wheaten and white-crumbed, where before it was barley and rye and gratitude. There is a proper cheese in the safe. I'll that the alewife would sign her name to, honey, a dish of pears from the tree on the strip Agnes took up when it fell vacant. She keeps 2 cows now. There is a new blanket on the bed, russet dyed, and the moralists up in the towns are scandalised by this sort of thing. A trim of rabbit fur on her Sunday hood. Preachers grumble that labouring folk are dressing above their station, eating above their station, walking about generally above their station. And if you listen closely, you can hear what that grumbling really is, which is the sound of ordinary people getting a little of their due. The table is fuller, the room is warmer, the evenings are longer at the sitting end. Survival, it turns out, was only the first chapter. After it comes this quieter one, in which the world tilts, just a few degrees, toward the people who do its work. So the village goes on, mended in the way living things mend, not as if nothing happened, but around what happened, the way a tree closes over a lost branch and keeps reaching. The bells ring for weddings and christenings and plain Sunday mornings. The manor court meets under the oak, and when the pestilence stirs again in later years, for it does return in smaller visitations, as such things did, the village meets it as people meet weather they have known before, soberly, with stocked shelves and steady neighbours, and without the old helpless dread. But while Agnes's countryside is healing itself with bacon and better wages, look south for a moment, far south, over the mountains to the warm sea where this whole story first came ashore. The merchant cities of the Mediterranean have been doing their own thinking. They cannot raise wages against the sea. Ships will always come from every port and every rumour. So the cleverest of them, Venice in her lagoon and the little sea republic of Ragusa on its sunlit rock, begin to reach toward an idea so simple and so patient that it will still be protecting the world 6 centuries from now. Not a wall, not a remedy, just time. A measured, deliberate stretch of waiting at the harbour's edge. The sailors will come to call those days by a number, and that number, and the gates and islands built to keep it, is where we are walking next. And while the villages of England are settling into that fuller, kinder ordinary, something else is happening far to the south. Something quieter than a harvest and slower than a rumour, and yet it will change the shape of the world more surely than any battle, because the world has been paying attention. The pestilence taught its terrible lesson, and in 2 small republics on the edge of the sea, people have begun very carefully to answer it. So come south with me now, down the long roads and over the mountains, until the air turns warm and smells of salt and pine resin, and the light takes on that particular honeyed clarity it only has above the Adriatic. We're going to a walled city on the Dalmatian coast. Ragusa, the place we now call Dubrovnik, where the stone is pale as bread flour and the sea below the ramparts is a deep, patient blue. It is the year 1377, a generation after the Great Mortality, and the memory of it is still folded into every household here like a letter kept at the bottom of a chest. Ragusa lives by its ships. Everything comes and goes by water, wool and wax, silver and salt, wine and pepper, and every sail on the horizon is both a promise and a question. And in the summer of 1377, on the 27th day of July, the city's great council gathers in its cool stone hall and writes down a small, extraordinary sentence. Those arriving from plague-touched places the councillors decide shall not enter the city until they have first rested a full month, 30 days, in an appointed place apart under the open sky, where the city can watch and wait. They called it Trentino from the word for 30. It is, as far as anyone has ever been able to tell, the first time in the history of the world that waiting itself was written into law as a medicine. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because there is something almost tender in it. No one in that council chamber knows what the pestilence actually is. They cannot see it, cannot name it, will not understand it for another 500 years. But they have noticed something true, that the sickness travels with travellers, and that time, plain, ordinary, uneventful time, reveals it. If a crew waits a month on the little island of Murken, or in the small harbour town of Kavtat down the coast, and no one sickens, then the city gates may open to them with a clear conscience. Patience, it turns out, is the first quarantine. The wisdom arrived long before the understanding did, the way a grandmother's remedy sometimes works for reasons she never needed to know. And here, at one of the gates of that watchful city, I'd like you to meet someone. Katerina is a gatekeeper's daughter, about 20, auburn hair loosely braided over one shoulder, in a teal wool dress with russet lacing at the bodice. Her father keeps one of the harbour gates, and she has grown up inside its rhythms. The great hinges groaning at dawn, the smell of tarred rope and drying fish, the little brazier where the watchmen warm their hands on winter mornings. She brings her father his bread and soft cheese at midday, and she has learned, the way children of gatekeepers do, to read a harbour the way a farmer reads the sky. Stand beside her on the wall in the early evening, and you can see the new order of things laid out on the water. A merchant ship rides at anchor well outside the harbour mouth, sails furled, hull rocking gently on the swell. She has come from the east, from ports where the sickness has been whispered of, and so she waits. A guard boat rows out to her. You can hear the oars creak and dip, and there is a conversation carried on across a careful stretch of open water. Where from, what cargo, what health aboard. Papers are held up, days are counted, nobody shouts, nobody panics. The ship simply waits, and the city simply watches, and between them lies that gentle, deliberate distance that is the whole invention. Katerina's father calls it good gatekeeping, nothing more. You let the grain in and you keep the trouble out, and mostly you do it by being unhurried. Historians still wonder exactly how those first Trentini were provisioned and guarded. The records are thin, but we know the crews were fed and watched and released with the council's blessing when their month ran clean. And the idea spreads, the way good ideas do, from harbour to harbour along the trade routes like a lantern passed hand to hand. Venice, that great floating marketplace at the head of the Adriatic, takes it up and makes it her own. Venice, after all, has islands to spare, a whole lagoon scattered with them, like crumbs brushed from a table, and so she does the most Venetian thing imaginable. She gives the waiting an address. In 1423 the Republic sets aside an island near the city, by the old church of Santa Maria di Nazareth, as a permanent house of waiting. People soften the name into Lazaretto, perhaps borrowing a little from poor patient Lazarus along the way. And somewhere in those years the 30 days stretch to 40, quaranta giorni, the quarantina, and there it is, the word we still use, born on these docks. 40 felt right to them. It was the number of the flood, of Lent, of the wilderness. The old physicians taught that an illness declared itself within 40 days. And here is the quiet marvel. Centuries later we would learn that plague runs its full hidden course in a ship's crew in just about that many days. They had, without knowing it, measured the shadow of the thing almost exactly. By 1468 Venice adds a second island, the Lazaretto Nuovo, standing guard where the sea lanes enter the lagoon, not for the sick but simply for the arriving, crews, passengers and cargo, all pausing there before the city takes them in. Lamps are lit on its walls at dusk, and if you're wondering what those 40 days were actually like, the airing racks, the card games, the letters home, then let the guard boat carry us across the darkening water, because that small island is exactly where we're going next. The guard boat slips across the lagoon in the last of the light, and the island rises ahead of you, a low-walled rectangle on the water, brick and pale plaster, with a lantern already burning above its landing stage. From a distance, the Lazaretto Nuovo looks like a small castle that has decided, on reflection, to be a farm. Inside its walls there are rows of plain lodging rooms, 100 of them and more, a well, a chapel, kitchen fires, and one building so large it seems to belong to a bigger island altogether. The Tesson Grande, a great brick warehouse over 100 paces long, with arched doorways down both sides and a vaulted roof that holds the cool of the night all through the day. Step through one of those arches, and you find yourself in what might be the most peaceful industry in the world. This is where the cargo of a waiting ship spends its 40 days. Bales of wool, bolts of silk and linen, sacks of pepper and ginger, crates of wax and hides. Everything is carried in on the shoulders of the porters, opened and laid out on long wooden racks in the moving air. Because here is the thing the Venetians had noticed, patient observers that they were. It was not only people who seemed to carry the sickness from port to port. It was things, and above all soft things. Wool, cloth, furs, feather beds. So the goods take their quarantine too. Twice a day the porters turn them, the way you'd turn hay in a meadow so the air reaches every fold. Smoke from little braziers of rosemary and juniper drifts along the racks, sweet and resinous, curling up into the rafters. Some goods are rinsed in salt water. Coins pass through basins of vinegar with a small bright clinking. And letters are dipped in vinegar or held in the herb smoke, sometimes with little slits cut in them so the fumes can reach right inside the fold. Somewhere in Venice, a merchant would receive news from Alexandria smelling faintly of rosemary. The paper crisped at the edges, and know that his letter too had done its 40 days. They were wrong about the reason. They blamed corrupted air, bad vapours clinging to the fibres, and yet they were so nearly right about the remedy that it hardly mattered. Soft goods can harbour fleas, and fleas carried the true culprit. 40 days of sun, air and turning was, without anyone knowing it, a genuinely useful cure for a bale of wool. Once again, the wisdom arrived centuries ahead of the explanation, and worked quietly in the meantime. The porters themselves are worth a moment. They were called Bastazzi, and many of them came from the same cluster of mountain valleys near Brescia, 120 miles away. A long walk to a strange trade, and they could write. We know this because they left their handwriting all over the walls of the Tesson in charcoal and red ochre, and much of it is still there. Names and dates. The names of ships and the ports they'd sailed from. Little drawings, hearts, saints, the Lion of Venice. One of them paused in his work to record, right there on the warehouse wall, the election of a new doge, the way you might jot news in the margin of a calendar. Ordinary men keeping ordinary accounts of themselves in a place built entirely out of patience. 500 years later you can still stand in that long room and read them, and the travellers, their 40 days pass in lodging rooms around the compound, and the days find a rhythm the way days always do. Meals come from the island kitchens or a road across from the city. There is bread, cheese, wine, fish, broth. Men play cards and dice through the warm afternoons, quietly mostly, though the superintendent keeps an ear out. They walk the walls and watch the fishing boats. They mend clothes, tell over their business, and write letters home that will be smoked and vinegared and sent on their way. A merchant might grumble that 40 days is a long time to sit within sight of the city he can't enter. The bell towers of Venice float on the horizon, close enough to count, but there is wine with supper and shade at noon, and the particular calm of a place where nothing can be hurried. Because hurry is the one thing the island was built to refuse. The whole lagoon, in time, learns this choreography. Arriving ships show their papers, Fedi di Sanità, little printed certificates swearing they sailed from a clean port, and the Republic keeps permanent magistrates of health, sober men whose entire office is watching, counting and deciding when to wait. Ragusa had led the way there too, appointing her own health officers back in 1390, almost before anyone else in the world had thought of such a thing. And in Ragusa the harbour rhythm holds just the same. Caterina rows out with her father some mornings to the watch-post, the boat riding low with fresh loaves and a jug of thin wine for the men on duty, and she has learned to tie up at the seaward stair, pass the basket across and keep the boat's length of blue water between herself and the quarantined quay, a courtesy so practised it has become as natural as a curtsy. This system, begun with one sentence in a council hall, would go on working island by island and port by port for more than 400 years. When a crew's 40 days run clean, there is a small, well-worn ceremony to the release, the record checked, the pratica granted, the gates opened. The men rowed at last across the water they have stared at for 6 weeks. You can imagine the first steps on the city stones. The first proper meal, the first sleep in a bed that doesn't smell of juniper smoke. But not every island in the lagoon is a waiting room. On the older island, the Lazaretto Vecchio, the sick themselves attended with nurses and broth and clean straw, and it is there, and in the pest houses of 100 other cities, that we meet one of history's strangest and most misunderstood figures. A doctor in a long waxed coat, with round glass eyes and a beak full of flowers. He looks alarming in the pictures. He was in truth something much gentler, and he deserves a kindly visit next. So let us pay that visit gently, because the figure of the plague doctor has been borrowed so often for masks and nightmares that we forget what he actually was. A person, usually a rather brave one, hired by a city to walk toward the very thing everyone else was walking away from. The famous costume comes late in our story, and it comes from Paris. In 1619, a physician named Charles de Lorme, doctor to the King of France himself, thought carefully about how a man might visit the sick and come home safe, and he designed an outfit for it, the way you might design a fisherman's oilskins. A long coat from neck to ankle, cut like a soldier's canvas gown. Boots, breeches, gloves, and a broad-brimmed hat, all of supple Moroccan goat leather. and all of it waxed and scented so that nothing, no air, no vapour, no touch, could reach the skin. Over the eyes, round panes of glass like small spectacles grown ambitious, and over the face, the famous mask, a nose half a foot long shaped like a beak with just 2 small breathing holes, and the whole hollow of it packed with sweetness. And oh, what they packed into that beak! Dried roses and carnations, lavender, mint, cloves and juniper berries, camphor, myrrh, sweet gums and resins, sometimes a sponge dabbed with vinegar. The doctors believed the plague rode on foul air, on miasma, the bad breath of the world, and so they walked inside a portable garden, breathing through flowers. Every breath the doctor took on the worst street on the worst day of the year came to him filtered through lavender and rose petals. They were wrong about the air, as we now know, and yet the way this story keeps unfolding, they were accidentally half right in practice. Thick waxed leather from chin to ankle is a discouraging landscape for a flea, and the doctor was safer in his strange armour than he could possibly have understood. In his hand he carried a slender wooden wand, and this little stick might be the most eloquent part of the whole costume. With it, he could lift a blanket. He could take a pulse of sorts, feel where a patient pointed, indicate to a family what should be washed or aired or carried out to the fire, all at a small and careful distance. The wand was the harbour gate again, in miniature, not a wall but a courtesy. A way of staying present without touching, of saying, I am here, and I am staying, while still going home at night to someone who needed him to come home. And here is the detail worth sitting with. Many of these doctors were paid by the town itself, contracted like the well digger or the bell founder, and their contracts often said, in plain ink, that they must treat everyone, the poor as freely as the rich. A city that hired a plague doctor was making a quiet promise to its humblest street. Someone will come. He might be young, newly qualified, earning his way. He might be old and stubborn and beloved. However he came, the sound of his knock meant that the town had not forgotten you. Around him worked a whole gentle machinery, mostly unfamous. There were the pest houses, plain lodgings outside the walls, whitewashed rooms with beds of clean straw where the sick could be nursed away from the crowded lanes, with kitchens sending out broth and women keeping the fires and the linen. There were the watchmen who stood at the doors of sick households, and it's easy to picture them as jailers. But read the old orders closely and you find their other duty written just as firmly. To fetch for the family whatever they needed, bread, medicine, small beer, a message carried to a cousin, so that a shut door never quite meant a severed thread. And there were the searchers, most often elderly parish women, who carried little white wands of office through the streets and did the sad, needful work of recording who had died and of what, so the town could count, and plan and know itself. Nurses, watchers, porters, grave diggers with their steady dignity, apothecaries grinding their pastes and waters, none of them could cure the plague. All of them, together, were the reason a city could pass through it and still be a city on the far side. Katerina, on the Ragusa walls, has seen the visiting physician set out for the harbourside lodgings in the cool of the morning, coat brushed, satchel packed, beak freshly filled, and she told her father once that he looked like a heron picking its way along the shore, mild and deliberate. It is hard to improve on that. A heron, not a raven, a patient fisher of small mercies standing quietly in the shallows of the worst days and staying. Historians still wonder how many doctors truly wore the full costume. Outside the great cities it may have been rarer than the pictures suggest, many making do with a scented handkerchief and courage. But the beaked figure endured in memory because of what it meant, that care itself had put on a uniform, that someone had thought and planned and sewn and packed flowers into leather, all so that comfort could keep arriving, and arrive it would need to again and again down another 3 centuries, because the waiting islands and the herb-filled beaks could slow the old sickness, but not yet end it, and it had one more great visit to pay to a city we know well. So leave the warm Adriatic now and come north with me, over the sea lanes those quarantined ships kept safe to England, to London, in the sweet green spring of the year 1665. It is a city of church bells and river fog, of street cries and coal smoke, 100 parishes packed inside and around its old Roman wall, and it is about to live through the last and most famous of its plague years. But it doesn't know that yet. On the April morning where we'll arrive, the bells are ringing for plain Sunday reasons. The Thames is bright, and in a little shop smelling of nutmeg and sugar, a woman we are going to be very glad to know is taking down her shutters. Her name is Mary, and the shutters come down with a practised clatter she could manage in her sleep. She's a grocer's wife, about 35, brown hair tucked beneath a white linen coif, in a burgundy wool bodice and skirt with a plain apron over it, and a neckerchief pinned neat at her throat. And this shop, her husband's and hers, in a narrow street off Cheapside, close enough to hear Bow Bells count the hours, is her small kingdom. Step inside and take a good slow breath, because a grocer's shop in 1665 is one of the best-smelling rooms in all of London. Nutmeg, first, warm and woody, from the little brass grater kept by the scales. Then cinnamon and cloves, black pepper, ginger, the winey sweetness of currants and raisins of the sun in their open drawers, a dark ribbon of treacle, the clean dusty smell of starch, and under everything sugar. The sugar stands on the top shelf in tall loaves shaped like bells, each one wrapped in thick blue paper, and when a customer wants a £1/4, Mary takes down a loaf, unwraps its stiff blue skin, and nips off glittering pieces with a pair of sugar nips, weighing them out against small brass weights that live in a nested set, each one sitting inside the next like ducklings. She twists the sugar up in a neat paper cone, ties it with a whisper of string, and there it goes, out into the morning in somebody's basket. The morning itself is a kind of music. London wakes early and loudly, and the street cries come past the shop door in waves. Milk below, fresh mackerel, sweet oranges, small coal, old shoes to mend. Cartwheels grind on the cobbles. A neighbour's boy chases a hoop. The bells of 100 parish churches take turns marking the quarter hours until the whole city seems gently upholstered in bell sound. Down the hill the Thames glitters, so thick with wherries and barges it looks like a street itself. The watermen calling oars. Oars, sculls to anyone hesitating on the stairs. London Bridge stands on its 19 stone feet with shops and houses built clean across it, so that you can walk from one bank to the other and never quite notice the river underneath you. Mary's days have a shape as settled as the bells. Up before 6 the fire raked and fed, small beer and bread and butter for breakfast, the shop open by 7. Her husband minds the heavy trade. The whole loaves, the pepper by the pound, the accounts in their long ledger, while Mary keeps the counter, and keeps too the shop's other ledger. The invisible one, who is newly married, whose mother is ailing, whose credit is good though his coat is shabby, which apprentice can be trusted with the change. A grocer's wife stands all day at one of the great listening posts of a city. Everything London knows comes past her counter eventually, wrapped in its own small purchase. And this spring, among the talk of prices and the Dutch war and the price of pepper, there is a new thread in the talk, thin as pack thread but persistent. It concerns a printed paper. Every week the parish clerks gather up the numbers of burials from every parish in and about the city, and print them on a single sheet called the Bill of Mortality, which anyone can buy for a penny. Most weeks it makes dull, reassuring reading, but since the winter people have been reading the bills the way sailors read the sky. There was that comet in December. Everyone saw it, hanging over the rooftops like a held breath, and everyone had an opinion. And then, in the cold weeks after, out in the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, beyond the western wall, where the poor lodge close together, the bills began to show a word that London knows of old, appearing and disappearing again like something glimpsed between fence boards. 1 week, nothing. Another week, 1 or 2. The careful readers noticed. The hopeful readers noted how small the numbers were. A gentleman of the Navy Office, a Mr. Pepys, confided to his diary at the end of April what half the city was thinking, and few said aloud. Great fears of the sickness here in the city, God preserve us all. But fear in April is still only a seasoning, and life is the meal. This is worth remembering about London in the spring of 1665. It was vivid, and busy, and glad of itself. The theatres are open, the coffee houses are loud with news and smoke, the gardens beyond the wall are white with blossom. In Mary Street, a wedding party goes by on a Tuesday with ribbons on their hats. Trade is good, sugar moves briskly, the shop takes delivery of a new chest of nutmegs, and Mary, here is her small secret and you may keep it with me, slips 1 nutmeg into her apron pocket for luck and for the pleasure of it, because a fresh nutmeg carried in the pocket was held to be wholesome, and besides it makes her apron smell faintly of far away. On Sunday the whole street goes to church, and Mary sits in the pew with her hands folded, hearing the psalms in the light of the tall clear windows. On the way home there is talk at the corner, the bills again, and whether the sickness will stay out west where it began. And old Widow Hartley saying, as she says every year about everything, that she has seen worse. The city has seen worse, that is true. It has also, though nobody in the street can know it, never seen quite what is coming. For now, let it be spring. Let the shop bell ring its bright small ring, let the sugar nips flash, let the river run busy and the 100 steeples keep the hours. But the days are lengthening toward a summer that will be long and hot and dry. Week after week of high blue skies, the kindest weather imaginable, arriving at the unkindest time, and in the bills of mortality the little numbers out west have begun, very quietly, to climb. And before midsummer, on certain doors in certain streets there will appear a mark in red and 7 painted words that all of London will learn by heart. By June the whispers have stopped being whispers. The numbers on the printed bills of mortality have climbed quietly week by week, the way a tide climbs a stair. And now, walking with Mary through her own parish on a warm summer morning, you see the first of the marks. On a door in a narrow lane, a cross has been painted in red, a foot long, and above it in careful letters the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." It is not a shout. It is something closer to a prayer left where everyone can read it. You stand with her a moment, at a respectful distance, and then you both walk on. Because there is a shop to open, and the city even now must be fed. This is the long summer of 1665, and London is learning to live alongside its visitor. Before each marked door sits a watchman, one for the day and one for the night, a man with a halberd and a stool and a great deal of time. His task is to keep the household within for 40 days and to fetch what they need: bread, candles, a message carried to a cousin across the river. The watchmen are not villains in this story. Most of them are ordinary men glad of the wages, and the better sort become something like servants to the families they guard, lowering baskets, passing news through shutters, learning which child likes which kind of bun. It is a strange, small kindness, sitting all night on a stool outside a stranger's sorrow, and the city is full of it. The heat settles in, the streets grow quieter than any summer Mary can remember, but they are never entirely empty, and through them, most mornings, walks a brisk round-faced gentleman from the Navy Office named Samuel Pepys, who is keeping a diary, and who will, without meaning to, keep this whole year for us. Early in June he sees his first Red Cross doors in Drury Lane, and it troubles him so much that he stops and buys a roll of tobacco to smell and to chew, because everyone says tobacco guards against the bad air. He walks on chewing it, feeling a little braver, and from then on he rarely goes out without some. All over London people are doing the same. A sprig of rue held to the nose, a handful of wormwood, a pipe lit not for pleasure but for protection. The air itself is thought to carry the sickness, and so the city fights air with air, smoke, herbs, vinegar, the sharp and the sweet. Pepys has other worries too, and one of them is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is so wonderfully human. He has a new periwig, a fine, fashionable head of curls, bought only lately in Westminster, and he hardly dares to wear it, because the hair in such wigs comes from who knows where, and everyone whispers that no one will buy periwigs now for fear of where the hair was cut. He frets about it in his diary the way you might fret about a small extravagance in a hard year. And then, one Sunday in September, he puts it on anyway, reasoning that it was bought long enough ago to be safe, and goes to church, feeling, one suspects, both anxious and rather splendid. The plague is vast and the periwig is small, and the diary holds them both side by side, which is exactly how ordinary life carries trouble. The great fear and the little vanity in the same pocket. Mary's days narrow and steady. The court has gone. The king and his people slipped away in July, first to Salisbury and then to Oxford, and many of the wealthy have followed, their coaches rolling west with feather beds strapped on behind. But a city is not its wealthy. A city is its bakers, who must still fire their ovens before dawn, its watermen, still pulling passengers across the brown, patient Thames, its market women, walking in from the fields at the city's edge with butter and beans and cherries. The country people grow wary of coming too far in, so meeting places spring up at the edges of town, where produce is set down on the grass, and coins are dropped into pots of vinegar, and everyone steps back and nods and wishes each other well from a few yards apart. It is trade conducted like a slow, careful dance, and it works. London, even this summer, does not go hungry. In Mary's shop, the sugar cones still hang in their blue paper, and the nutmegs sell faster than they ever have, because nutmeg is said to be a guard against infection, and nearly everyone can afford one nutmeg. She serves fewer customers, but she knows each of them now by name and by trouble, whose house is shut, whose sister has gone to cousins in Epping, whose husband still rows the ferry. The talk over the counter is gentle and practical, where bread is cheapest, which conduit runs sweetest. Who needs a meal carried round? In the evenings the bells toll, more often than anyone would wish, and Mary stands in her doorway and listens, and then goes in and banks the fire, because grief is real, but so is tomorrow's opening hour. At the worst of it, in September, the weekly bill will record more than 7,000 names in 7 days, and even the clerks suspect the true number is higher, for the poorest are not always counted. It is a weight the city carries together, one bell, one bill, one shuttered shop at a time, and yet, and this is the quiet miracle of that summer, the carts still come in from the gardens at dawn, the ovens are still hot, the watchmen still fetch the buns, and somewhere on a quiet street, a man in a periwig is still writing it all down by candlelight so that we can walk here tonight. Courage, that year, mostly looked like going to work, and because fear always sends people looking for something to hold, the city fills with sellers of remedies, waters and powders, cordials and charms, some sold in kindness and some in mischief. Mary keeps her own small defences behind the counter, and it is to those and to the women who nursed and watched through that summer that we will turn next. The remedies arrive before the sickness does, and they outnumber it handsomely. All that summer, London's posts and doorways bloom with printed papers, each promising more than the last. Infallible preventive pills against the plague, sovereign cordials against the corruption of the air, the only true plague water, never known to fail. Some of the sellers believe in their bottles. Some, it must gently be said, believe mainly in the pennies. But if you stand at a street corner with Mary and watch the people buying, you understand it at once. A small green bottle in the pocket is not really medicine. It is a handhold. It is something to do with your fear other than carry it. And at a penny or two it is cheaper than despair. Plague water itself is a real recipe, and rather a lovely one. Rue and rosemary, sage and wormwood, angelica and a dozen other garden herbs, steeped in wine or spirits and distilled into something sharp and bracing. The College of Physicians publishes its own approved remedies, and the apothecaries who remain, and for many to their lasting honour do remain, grind and steep and distill from morning to night. There is Venice treacle, that ancient dark syrup of many ingredients, and its local cousin London treacle, and pomanders of orange stuck round with cloves, and sponges soaked in vinegar to hold beneath the nose. Little of it can cure. Historians still wonder whether any of it helped at all, beyond the herb's clean smell and the comfort of ritual. But comfort is not nothing in a frightened city, and the smell of rosemary in a close room is its own small mercy. What truly helped was older and plainer, and it wore an apron. It was rest, and clean linen, and broth kept warm at the hearth, and water brought to a dry mouth at 2 a.m. It was the nurse-keepers, women hired by the parish to be shut in with the sick, who fed the fire and changed the sheets and sat through the long hours when sitting was all that could be done. Some were careless, and the pamphlets complained of them loudly as pamphlets do, but most were simply poor women doing hard and dangerous work for a shilling, and doing it night after night with more steadiness than the city ever quite thanked them for. And there were the searchers, elderly women, most of them widows on parish pension, who carried white wands so that others could give them room, and who went to each house where death had visited, and looked and reported gently to the clerk what the cause had been. Their word became the numbers on the bills of mortality, which means the great record of that year, read by kings and printed for the world, rested finally on the careful eyes of old women walking from door to door, doing a task nobody wanted with a patience nobody recorded. It is worth sitting with for a moment. How much of history is held up by exactly such people? Mary's own defences are small, practical, and mostly to do with vinegar. On her counter sits a shallow dish of it, and every coin that crosses her threshold goes first into the vinegar and is fished out only when it has had its bath. Whether the vinegar cleanses the coin or merely the conscience, no one can say, but every shopkeeper still open in London does the same, and the sharp smell of it has become the smell of shops themselves. She serves customers through the broad window now rather than the door when she can, passing parcels at arm's length with a smile that does the work her nearness used to do. Meals at her table have gone simple. Pottage, bread, a little cheese, small beer, partly thrift, partly the sense that plain food keeps a body steady. Her household rises early, washes with well water, strews the floor with fresh rushes and wormwood, and burns a little rosemary on the fire of an evening, so that the last smell of the day is a green one. And between the houses, quietly, the kindness runs like a watercourse. A loaf left on the step of a shut-up house, with a knock and a retreat. A note passed up on a stick to a second-floor window telling a shut-in family that their cousin in Southwark is well. Mary keeps a slate behind her counter with names on it, households whose money has run out, and their parcels go out anyway, weighed a little generously. The debt recorded in chalk and, more often than not, eventually wiped away with her thumb. The parish officers carry bread and coal to the poorest of the shut houses, for the law that seals a door also promises to feed the people behind it, and though the promise limps sometimes, it mostly keeps its feet. The sick houses are tended. That is the sentence that Summer keeps writing in 100 small hands. The sick houses are tended. In the evenings, when the shutters are up, Mary and her husband count the till by candlelight, vinegar-scented coins in little towers, and talk over the day's news in low voices. So much of it is heavy. But there is other news too, the kind that travels slowly and arrives softened. A christening in the next parish. A good hay harvest in Essex. A ship comes safe up the river. The city is enduring, and it knows it is enduring. And there is a kind of tired tenderness in the streets that no one will ever quite manage to describe. Though a diarist near the tower is doing his best, and we are grateful. Far to the north of all this, in the hills of Derbyshire, the same sickness has arrived by quieter means, in a box of cloth sent up from London to a village tailor. And what that small village chooses to do about it, freely, together, at a cost it understood, will become one of the gentlest and bravest stories in all this long night. The village is called Eyam, and we will walk there now, while the moon is up. Eyam sits in a fold of the Derbyshire hills, a single street of grey-stone cottages with lead miners' lamps in the windows and sheep on the slopes above, about as far from London's crowded lanes as an English village can feel. In the first days of September 1665, a bundle of cloth arrives at the tailor's cottage, ordered up from London for the autumn sewing. The journey has left it damp, and the tailor's assistant, a young man named George Vickers, does the sensible thing. He opens the bundle and hangs the cloth before the fire to dry. No one in the room can see what the cloth has carried with it from the city. Within the week, George is ill, and within another few days the church bell tolls for him, the first in Eyam. Through that autumn the sickness moves quietly along the little street, house by house, and then winter comes and it seems to sleep and the village dares to hope. But with the warm weather of 1666 it wakes again, and by early summer the people of Eyam understand that it has truly settled among them, and here is where this village does the thing for which it will be remembered as long as England remembers anything. The rector, William Mompesson, is young, not yet 30, and new to the parish, and not much loved yet. The man before him, Thomas Stanley, still lives at the village edge, and the two men, who differ on nearly everything a rector can differ on, agree completely on this. They call the village together, and they ask something enormous in the plainest words, that no one leave, that Eyam draw a circle around itself, and hold its sickness inside that circle, so that it cannot travel to Sheffield, to Bakewell, to the market towns and the villages of the whole county round. Anyone who stays may die. Everyone who stays protects someone they will never meet. And the village, farmers, miners, wives, grandmothers, talks it through, and agrees, and stays. There is no wall, no soldier, no lock. There is only a promise kept by a few hundred ordinary people for over a year. The practical arrangements have a homely gentleness that is worth every detail. On the hill towards Stony Middleton stands a boundary stone, and into its flat top the villagers drill small round holes. Coins go into the holes, and vinegar is poured over the coins, for the vinegar is trusted to cleanse them. And the neighbours from Stony Middleton, who owe Eyam nothing, remember, come up the hill and leave food beside the stone, bread, cheese, meat, oatmeal, and take the vinegar-washed coins, and sometimes leave the goods and quietly refuse the money altogether. At a spring north of the village, ever after called Mompesson's Well, the same slow trade goes on, supplies set down by cold running water. And from Chatsworth, the great house over the hills, the Earl of Devonshire sends provisions freely week after week, asking nothing. The circle around Eam, you see, is held from both sides, by those keeping the promise within and by those keeping the promised fed from without. The church is closed, for gathering indoors seems dangerous now, and so on Sundays the village walks down into a green dell called Cucklet Delph, where a limestone arch stands over the grass like a doorway that leads only to more meadow. Mompesson preaches from the rock, and the families stand apart from one another, each household its own small island on the grass, a dozen feet of summer air between them. Prayers rise over the sound of the brook. It is church stripped back to almost nothing. Sky, stone, voices, and many later said it was the truest worship they had known. The village buries its own, near their homes, in gardens and fields, quickly and with quiet respect, because the churchyard and its crowds must wait for a safer year. Some of what was born in Eam should be spoken softly and briefly, the way the village itself bore it. A farmer's wife named Elizabeth Hancock had a farm called Riley on the eastern hill, lost her husband and 6 of her children in the space of 8 days in August 1666, and with no one able to come near, she buried each of them herself in the field by the farm. She dug and prayed and covered, and went back to the house 7 times. She never fell ill. She lived, and later left the silent farm to join a surviving son in Sheffield, and the little cluster of stones on that hillside, the Riley graves, stands to this day, kept mown and tended by strangers who never knew her and cannot forget her. And Catherine Mompesson, the rector's wife, who had every chance to leave and would not, walked with her husband one August evening and remarked how sweet the air smelled, and was gone within days, and lies in the churchyard she helped so many others toward with a kindness that outlived her. The sickness burned hardest that August, then faded through the autumn, and by the end of October 1666 it was over. Around 260 of Eam's people had died. Historians still wonder exactly how many lived there to begin with, so the village's full cost keeps a little of its privacy, which seems only right. But this much is certain, and it is the point of the whole story. The plague never crossed the circle. The villages around Eam went untouched. Sheffield went untouched. A few hundred people in a fold of the hills looked at the worst thing in their world and chose to hold it, so that others would never have to. It was not a battle, and there was no victory bell. It was a gift given quietly at full price and received by people who never knew the givers' names. If you ever walk that single street at dusk, past the low stone cottages with their little plaques, you will find it one of the most peaceful places you have ever stood. And while Eam kept its promise in the hills, down in London the year was turning at last and the city's deliverance was coming, not as a medicine, but as weather. It comes first as a change in the mornings. Sometime in October, Mary steps out to take down her shutters and finds her breath hanging in the air, and the puddles between the cobbles wearing thin skins of ice. The cold deepens week by week, an honest, hard, frosted autumn sliding into an honest winter, and as it deepens, the numbers on the weekly bills begin to fall. No one entirely understands why. They thank the frost for scouring the air, and in a roundabout way they are not wrong, for the cold quiets the fleas that no one yet suspects, but understanding can wait. What matters is the direction of the numbers, down and down again, and down the week after that, like a fever breaking in the body of the city itself. People buy the bills now with a different feeling in their fingers. There comes a week in December when a man in the street reads the total aloud to strangers, twice just to hear it said. By the year's end, the diarist near the tower is writing that the plague is abated almost to nothing, and the streets are showing it. Every day, a few more shutters come down that had been up for months. Every day. A cart arrives from the countryside carrying not produce but people. Families coming home, feather beds and children stacked together, faces turned toward chimneys they have thought about all autumn. The returning houses open their windows to the cold on purpose, airing rooms that have stood shut since summer, and all down Mary Street you can see the little ceremonies of homecoming. Fires lit in cold hearths, steps swept. A woman standing in her own doorway with a hand flat against the doorframe just touching it, the way you might touch the shoulder of a friend who's been ill and is better. In February the king comes back. The court returns to Whitehall on the 1st of the month, and though Mary has no great tenderness for courtiers, even she admits the city feels different with the palace lit. The way a house feels different when the front rooms are lived in again. The exchange fills. The waterman's stairs grow busy. And one plain morning that is like a holiday without being one, Mary props her shop door wide open for the first time since the summer, and the bell above it, a small brass bell her husband hung the year they married, rings itself gently on the draught. She has heard that bell 10,000 times. She stands quite still and listens to it anyway. Then the first customer of the morning steps in, stamping the cold off his boots, wanting nutmeg not against infection now but for a pudding, and the day simply begins the way days do. The vinegar dish stays on the counter a while longer, habits earned that hard are not surrendered quickly, but week by week the shop fills back up with its old vocabulary. The sugar cones in blue paper, the currants and mace, the smell of coffee beans that the young men are mad for, the gossip. So much gossip and most of it kind. Who has come home? Who has married? For there are many marriages that spring, as there always are after hard years, survivors reaching for each other with both hands. Who has taken over the shop 3 doors down and paints the front a hopeful green. The city does not forget its year. You can hear the difference in it. A certain gentleness between strangers, a habit of asking after one another's households and truly listening to the answer. But London's genius has always been the next morning. Barges on the tide, bread in the ovens, apprentices bickering in doorways, the whole vast, patient machinery of ordinary life turning itself back on, wheel by wheel. Pepys walks these same reopening streets, greeting men he had wondered if he would see again, and confides to his diary, with the honesty that makes us love him, that he has come through the terrible year in remarkably good health and spirits, and feels almost guilty for it. He needn't have. Somebody had to keep the accounts, and the fleet, and the record, and because he stayed and wrote, this whole year of watchmen and nutmegs and vinegar dishes was kept for us, folded quietly into shorthand, waiting. One soft thing more must be said, and then we will let it rest. The following September, this city of timber and thatch would meet a great fire, and be remade by it. But that is a story for another night, and tonight London is allowed simply to be well. So let us leave the city like this. It is an evening in early spring 1666. Mary bolts the shop door, banks the fire, and climbs the stairs with a candle. Below her window the street is quiet. Not the held-breath quiet of last summer, but the good quiet of a working street at rest. A neighbour's latch, a dog settling, the river going about its old business in the dark. Nearly 100,000 of her city did not see this spring, and she knows it, and holds a few of their names the way you hold a smooth stone in your pocket. But the shop bell will ring tomorrow, and the ovens are already warm somewhere, and the city that was promised to be finished is audibly, stubbornly, breathing. Survival, in the end, looked exactly like this. A swept step, a full kettle, a door open to a neighbour. The old visitor itself was quietly leaving the story of Western Europe now, though no one could know it. It would come back only once more in force, half a century on and far to the south, where the light is different and the sea is a warm blue, to a great French harbour city smelling of salt and pine resin. When a merchant ship called the Grand Saint-Antoine came home to Marseille with silks and cottons in her hold, and something else besides. That is where our road bends next, down through France to the Mediterranean shore, while the night is still deep and unhurried. And as London settles back into its ordinary noise, you find yourself drifting south, the way warmth drifts, down through half a century of quieter years toward the Mediterranean. The air changes as you go. It softens. It begins to smell of salt and thyme and warm stone, and by the time you arrive it's the spring of 1720, and you're standing above the old harbour of Marseille, watching the evening sun turn the water the colour of hammered copper. This is a city that lives by its port. Fishing boats with rust-red sails come and go all day, and the quays are stacked with barrels of olive oil, sacks of chickpeas, coils of rope that smell of tar. Somewhere below you, church bells are ringing the hour, unhurried, and gulls are arguing over a basket of sardines with no particular malice. Down in the fishing quarter, where the lanes are narrow enough to touch both walls at once, you meet Jean. She's a fisherman's wife of about 40, and she's doing what she does every evening at this hour, which is mending a net by the doorway while a pot of soup murmurs on the fire behind her. Her husband's boat came in an hour ago. The catch was good. There is garlic in the soup and a little saffron, and the smell of it drifts out into the lane and mingles with wood smoke and the sea. It is in almost every way an ordinary evening in an ordinary port, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because Marseille is about to be asked to endure something, and the way it endures will close a very long chapter of this story. In late May of that year, a merchant ship called the Grand Saint-Antoine comes home from the eastern Mediterranean. She's been to Sidon and Smyrna, and her hold is full of bales of silk and fine cotton meant for the great summer fair at Beaucaire up the Rhône. There had been sickness aboard during the voyage, and the port authorities know it, and so the ship is sent to wait in quarantine, the old Venetian gift of 40 patient days. But the fair will not wait, and the cargo is worth a fortune, and some of the city's most powerful merchants have money resting in those bales. Quietly, the waiting is shortened. The goods come ashore early. It is one of those small human decisions made in a hurry that people will think about for a very long time afterward. Within weeks, the sickness is in the lanes, and here is the gentle truth of what follows. Marseille suffers and Marseille holds. The plague of 1720 will be the last great plague of Western Europe, the final visit of the old traveller you have been following all night, and the city meets it with everything people have learned across the centuries you have walked through. The quarantine island, the health certificates, the billets de santé that travellers must carry from town to town, watchmen at the gates, and people, always people, doing the small necessary things. There is a former naval officer, a man called the Chevalier Rose, who organises food and checkpoints in a hospital and an old rope works, and who leads volunteers into the hardest streets to do the work no one else will do. He falls ill himself and remarkably recovers. There is the city's bishop Belsunce, who refuses to leave, and who walks through the parishes on foot so that people can see that someone has stayed. Ordinary households do what Jeanne does. They keep the pot on the fire, they hang bundles of thyme and rosemary over the door, they wash the step with vinegar, they leave bread for the neighbour whose shutters have not opened, and they wait. The countryside, meanwhile, does something that you can still go and touch today. To the north, in the hills of the Vaucluse, lies a little papal territory around Avignon, and its authorities decide to protect their villages the only way they know, with stone. Through 1721, masons and farmers build a dry stone wall across the high country, about the height of a tall man, nearly 2 feet thick, running mile after mile over ridges of lavender and wild thyme. They call it the Mur de la Peste, the plague wall, and guards sit at little stone huts along its length, checking papers, turning back travellers without a clean bill of health. Historians still gently debate how much the wall itself accomplished, and how much was simply the patients it represented. But parts of it stand to this day, grey and quiet among the junipers, and walkers rest their hands on it in the afternoon heat, on stones set by people who wanted more than anything to keep their neighbours safe. As for the ship that began it all, she's towed out to a bare little island called Jara, and burned to the waterline, and the sea closes over what is left of her, and slowly, the way it always goes in this story, the city comes back. The plague ebbs within a couple of years. The port fills again with rust-red sails. Jean's quarter smells of soup and tar and church incense again, and the fair at Beaucaire goes on being held every summer as fairs do. Within a generation, Marseille is as full of people and noise as it ever was, and children play along the quays who will grow old without ever seeing the plague at all. That is a sentence you could not have said in any century you have visited tonight, and it deserves a moment of quiet gratitude. Because something is changing now. You can feel it in the air of the 18th century, like a window opened somewhere in a warm house. For all these long centuries, people have endured sickness without ever quite knowing what it was. They have been brave in the dark. But the dark itself is beginning to thin. In quiet gardens and letter-filled parlours, a few patient, curious people are starting to ask a new kind of question. Not only how do we bear this, but how do we stop it? And the first answer, oddly enough, is going to come from milkmaids, and from a determined lady with a sharp pen, and from the smallest of small things, a scratch on the arm. The scratch on the arm begins, of all places, in Constantinople, a city you have visited before on this walk, more than 1,000 years ago now, when Theodosia was baking bread beside the harbour. The sickness in question this time is not plague but smallpox, an old and familiar visitor in every country of the world, the one illness nearly everyone expected to meet sooner or later. And in the early 1700s, an Englishwoman named Lady Mary Wortley Montague arrives in Constantinople as the wife of the ambassador. She knows this illness personally. She caught it herself a few years before and survived, though it left its small marks on her famous face. Her younger brother was not so fortunate. So when she hears what the old women of the city can do, she pays very close attention. What they do is this. In the cool weeks of autumn, an experienced old woman comes to a household with a nutshell, an actual nutshell, holding a little matter taken from someone with a mild case of smallpox. With a fine needle, she makes the smallest of scratches on a child's arm and sets a trace of it beneath the skin. The children run a light fever for a few days, rest, are fussed over and fed well, and then get up again. And after that, almost entirely, smallpox never troubles them. Families gather to have it done together, the way you might gather for a christening. They call it engrafting, as if children were young apple trees being given a graft of hardiness. Lady Mary watches, asks questions, and writes it all down in a letter to a friend back home, in the spring of 1717, in her quick, warm, slightly mischievous hand. And then she does the thing that makes her part of this story forever. She has her own small son engrafted there in Constantinople, and later, back in London, her little daughter too, the first such operation in England, with grave physicians standing round the bed to watch a 3-year-old get better. It takes courage of a very particular, very parental kind, and she spent years afterward patiently persuading other mothers, one drawing room at a time. The practice spreads slowly, as new things do. It is not perfect. A scratch of real smallpox carries a real risk, and everyone knows it. But it is so much gentler than the illness at full strength that families across the century weigh the matter at their kitchen tables and more often roll up their children's sleeves, and while they do, out in the west of England, the second half of the answer is quietly grazing in a meadow. Because there is a piece of country wisdom passed between farms in Gloucestershire, that milkmaids who catch cowpox, a mild passing complaint of the hands, picked up from milking, never take smallpox afterward. It is one reason the milkmaid of a song and story has such a lovely clear complexion. Dairy folk have known it for generations. In the unbothered way country people know things. And in the small market town of Berkeley there is a country doctor named Edward Jenner who grew up hearing it, and who has the patient, unhurried sort of mind that takes folk wisdom seriously enough to test it gently. So, on a May morning in 1796, the pieces come together in his garden. A young milkmaid named Sarah Nelmes has a few cowpox sores on her hand, caught from a cow called Blossom, and it's somehow very comforting that the cow's name has come down to us, carefully recorded, as if history itself understood that Blossom mattered. Jenner takes a little matter from Sarah's hand and makes 2 small scratches on the arm of James Phipps, the 8-year-old son of his gardener. The boy is mildly poorly for a day or so, in the way of a light cold, and then perfectly well, and some weeks later, when Jenner tries the old engrafting on him, nothing happens at all, no fever, no spots, nothing. The cowpox has taught the boy's body to know the enemy without ever meeting it. Jenner calls the new method vaccination, from vacca, the Latin word for cow, so that every vaccine since carries a quiet tribute to Blossom in its name. And here is the part worth sitting with, the part that belongs to ordinary people. Jenner does not lock his discovery away. He builds a little one-room hut with a thatched roof in his garden, and he calls it, with a country doctor's fond grandness, the Temple of Vaccinia, and on certain days the poor of the parish line up outside it to be vaccinated for nothing. You can picture the queue on a soft grey morning. Farm labourers with their hats in their hands, mothers with babies wrapped against the damp, an old man telling the children it is nothing, barely a pin, over in a blink. Hope, after all these centuries, arriving not as a miracle or a proclamation, but as a small scratch on the arm and a dab of lint, and a doctor saying there now, all done. Years later, Jenner gave James Phipps a cottage of his own, with roses at the door, some debts a person remembers. The news travels the way the plague once travelled, along the same roads and shipping lanes, but carrying the opposite cargo. Within a decade, vaccination is being done in Paris and Vienna, in Spain and the Americas, passed arm to arm across whole oceans. It will take a long time, longer than anyone then alive could know, but the end of smallpox itself has quietly begun in a Gloucestershire garden, and it began with a milkmaid, a cow, and a gardener's son. And as the new century gets underway, the towns these vaccinated children grow up in are themselves changing, growing faster than they ever have, brick on brick, street on street. London swells toward 2 million people, then 3, and all those crowded new streets share wells and pumps and a river, which means the next visitor in our story will not come by ship at all. It will come of all quiet ways through a sip of water, and it will be answered by a doctor with a notebook, a map, and a very stubborn kind of patience. The doctor with the notebook lives in London, and to find him you walk forward into the summer of 1854, into a close-packed corner of the city called Soho. It is a neighbourhood of tailors and hatters and little workshops, of lodging houses where whole families share a room and keep it swept, of cowsheds and bakeries tucked behind the streets, washing strung between windows, children playing at the curb. On the corner of Broad Street stands the neighbourhood's pride, a public water pump with a long iron handle, and its water is known to be particularly good, cool, clear, sweet-tasting. People come from streets away to fill their jugs. There is a rhythm to it you would recognise from every century you have visited tonight. The clank of the handle, the splash in the pail, a bit of gossip while you wait your turn. The pump is the well of the medieval village, moved onto a paved corner and given an iron coat. At the end of August, cholera comes to Broad Street. It is a newer arrival in Europe, this illness, come along the trade routes earlier in the century, and it is frightening in a way we will step past gently. What matters for our story is that it strikes this one small neighbourhood very hard and very fast, and nobody knows why. The general wisdom still blames miasma, that old idea you have met so many times tonight. Bad air, foul smells, something drifting. It is the same explanation people reached for in Athens, in Constantinople, in Agnes's village. It has been wrong for a very long time, and it is about to be gently retired. Because a few streets away lives a doctor named John Snow, a quiet, methodical Yorkshireman, famous in his own field already, for he is one of the first masters of the new art of easing pain in surgery, and he has attended the Queen herself. He drinks no wine, keeps to himself, and has been nursing a suspicion for years that cholera travels not through the air but through water. Nobody of consequence believes him, so when the outbreak begins, he does the humblest thing a scientist can do. He goes for a walk. Door to door, street by street, notebook in hand, he asks the same gentle questions at each threshold. Was anyone here taken ill? Which pump do you draw your water from? And in the evenings, by lamplight, he marks each answer as a small black line on a map of the parish, house by house, until something extraordinary becomes visible. The illness gathers round the Broad Street pump the way iron filings gather round a magnet. The map holds its little mysteries too, and they turn out to be the most convincing part. The men at the brewery on Broad Street, dozens of them, are almost untouched, and it emerges that the brewery gives its workers a daily allowance of beer, so they simply never drink the pump water. The brewing, though no one quite frames it this way yet, has boiled the harm out. And far away in Hampstead, on the healthy high ground, one elderly widow falls ill who has not been near Soho at all, until Snow learns that she once lived on Broad Street, and loved the taste of that water so much that she had a bottle of it brought up to her by cart every day. It is such a human detail, that little vase of favourite water, and it settles the question in his mind completely. So on the evening of the 7th of September, Snow stands before the local parish board, tired men in a meeting room wanting to do right, and lays out his map and his notebook. They are not sure they believe him. But the next morning, the 8th of September 1854, someone unscrews the handle of the Broad Street pump and carries it away, and the neighbourhood's proud sweet water is quietly retired. The outbreak, already ebbing, gutters out, and in the months that follow, a young local curate named Henry Whitehead, who knows every family in these streets and sets out honestly to prove Snow wrong, ends up proving him right instead, tracing the trouble at last to an old leaking cesspit in the ground, barely 3 feet from the well, where the washing water from one sick household had drained. The curate and the doctor become unlikely friends, the skeptic and the map maker, and between them they have done something enormous with nothing but shoe leather, kindness, and arithmetic. It takes years for the idea to fully win, as ideas do, but when it wins on a scale that changes everything. In the hot summer of 1858, the River Thames, which has been swallowing the waste of 2 million people, announces itself so unmistakably that Parliament, sitting beside it, can no longer think about anything else. History remembers it with admirable restraint as the Great Stink, and out of that summer comes one of the gentlest heroes in this whole long story, an engineer named Joseph Bazalgette, who spends the better part of 20 years building London a hidden river system of its own, more than 80 miles of great brick main sewers, over 1,000 miles of street sewers, hundreds of millions of bricks laid in long, patient arches underground, carrying everything safely away from the wells and pumps and kitchens. He builds it larger than anyone thinks necessary, on the grounds that one only does this once, and his brick tunnels are still down there tonight, still working beneath the feet of a city that rarely thinks of them. After the sewers are finished, cholera never takes hold in London again. And that, quietly, is the shape of the answer people had been groping toward for 2,000 years. Not a miracle cure, not a secret elixir. Clean water. Taken for granted, the quietest hero of this entire story. Every time you fill a glass at a tap without a second thought, you're drinking Dr. Snow's map and Mr. Bazalgette's bricks. But one mystery still remains, the oldest one of all. What is the something that was in the water? The something in the flea, in the breath, in the grain chips? It has never once been seen, and in a French laboratory full of curious glassware, a man is about to catch it in the bend of a swan's neck. The glassware belongs to Louis Pasteur, and the swan's neck is exactly what it sounds like. In his Paris laboratory in the years around 1860, Pasteur takes ordinary glass flasks of clear broth and softens their necks in a flame, drawing each one out into a long, dipping, gracefully curved tube, open to the air at the far end, the shape of a swan lowering its head to drink. Then he boils the broth and simply lets the flasks sit. And here is the beautiful part. The broth stays clear. For weeks. For months. Some of his flasks are still clear today, more than a century and a half later, resting in a museum in Paris like sleeping proof. The air can reach the broth, but the dust in the air cannot. Every drifting speck settles harmlessly in the low bend of the curved neck, the way weary travellers settle at the first inn on the road. Tip the flask so the broth touches that bend, and within days it clouds with teeming life. The lesson, demonstrated with nothing more dramatic than soup and patience, is quietly enormous. Life does not spring from nowhere. The invisible something is real. It is alive, it travels, and it can be stopped by something as gentle as a curve in a piece of glass. You can stand in that laboratory for a moment, in the low afternoon light, the rows of flasks, the smell of beeswax and burnt wick. The little flame, a man in a dark coat holding a glass up to the window, with the particular stillness of someone listening. Pasteur is not a physician. He began with crystals and then with wine and beer, working out for France's brewers and vintners why their barrels went sour and how a brief, careful warming could protect them, which is why to this day the milk in your kitchen carries his name on its label. Pasteurized, one of the quietest memorials in the world. From spoiled wine it is a short step in his mind to the old question of sickness itself, and the germ theory of disease begins, at last to stand up and walk. In Germany, meanwhile, a country doctor named Robert Koch is working at the same mystery from his own parlour. His wife gives him a microscope for his 28th birthday, surely one of history's best chosen presents, and in a curtained-off corner of his consulting room, between seeing ordinary patients with coughs and bad knees, he teaches himself to grow the invisible creatures in captivity and to know one kind from another. One by one, through the 1870s and 1880s, the old terrors are brought into the light and given names: the germ of anthrax, the germ of tuberculosis, the germ of cholera. Dr. Snow's something in the water, seen at last under the lens, a tiny curved thing, real as a pebble. Each naming is a quiet detective story, the patient gathering of evidence, the careful lists, the moment when the culprit, invisible for all of human history, is finally looked in the eye. Which leaves the oldest culprit of all. The plague itself, the visitor of Justinian's harbour, of Agnes's village, of Ayam and London and Marseille, has still never been seen, and its unmasking comes fittingly at the far end of the world. In the summer of 1894, plague breaks out in Hong Kong, and among those who sail toward it rather than away is a young Swiss-French doctor named Alexandre Yersin, a pupil of Pasteur's, a shy, wiry, wandering soul who loves maps and quiet places. He arrives with little more than a microscope and a case of glass tubes, and finds the official doors mostly closed to him. A larger, better-equipped Japanese team led by the eminent Kitasato has the hospitals. So Yersin does what patient people in this story have always done. He makes do, kindly. He builds himself a small hut of bamboo and straw matting beside the hospital, sets up his bench inside it, and by quiet persistence, and a little judicious generosity to the sailors handling the burials, obtains what he needs. And there, in the damp heat on the 20th of June 1894, he touches his lens to a sample and sees it. A crowd of tiny rounded rods swarming, a whole puree of microbes, he writes in his notebook, with the astonishment still wet on the page. After 1400 years of bells and vinegar and guesses, the plague has a face. It is very, very small. Yersin notices something else too, walking the lanes. Everywhere the sickness goes, dead rats have gone first, and when he examines the rats, the same tiny rods are in them. A few years later, In Karachi, another of Pasteur's pupils, Paul-Louis Simond, works out the final link with a jar, a sick rat, and a healthy one that never touch each other. It is the flea leaping from a cooling rat in search of a warmer lodging that carries the sickness between them and sometimes to us. And with that, the whole long mystery you have been walking through tonight quietly resolves, like a chord settling. The grain ships of Constantinople, the rat in the thatch of Agnes's village, the bales of silk on the Grand Saint-Antoine, the miracle of Provence's stone wall and Venice's 40 days. All of it makes sense now, all of it explained by a bacillus. A flea and a rat named at last. The bacillus carries Yersin's own name, Yersinia pestis, a small immortality for the shy man in the straw hut. Centuries of fear gently folded up and put away like winter blankets. So as the new century opens, people allow themselves a soft, reasonable hope. The invisible world has been mapped, the old enemies named, the water made clean. Surely the worst of the long story is over, and it very nearly is. But the invisible world is deep, and it keeps a few travellers that even the finest microscopes of the age cannot see. Visitors smaller still than Yersin's bacillus. And in the spring of 1918, in the middle of an already weary world, one of them will begin, very quietly, to make its rounds. And so the old mystery has a name at last, and the new century comes in carrying that knowledge carefully, the way you might carry a lamp through a dark hallway. But knowledge takes its time settling into the world, and the world, as it turns out, has one more hard winter to ask of ordinary people first. So come with me now, across an ocean and generation, to the autumn of 1918, and to a small American town of the kind you could find in almost any state. A main street of brick and clapboard, a white church steeple, a depot where the trains sigh twice a day, and porches, porch after porch, each with its swing and its potted geranium going quietly to seed. This is where we find Elsie. She's about 22, honey blonde hair gathered in a soft low bun, and this evening she's standing at her mother's kitchen table in a plum-coloured cotton dress, an apron over it, with the kerosene lamp pulled close. Spread across the table is a bolt of white surgical gauze. The Red Cross has sent patterns to towns like hers, and the instructions are simple enough that a household can manage them after supper. Cut the gauze in oblongs, fold it 4 layers thick, sometimes 6. Stitch the edges and sew on cotton tape long enough to tie behind the head. Elsie's needle moves in small, even bites. Her mother works beside her, and the only sounds are the clock, the stove settling, and thread being drawn through cloth. By the end of the week, the two of them will have made several dozen masks, and there are kitchens like this one glowing on every street tonight, little circles of lamplight, each with its scissors and its spooled thread. There was even a rhyme for it in the newspapers that year, a jingle people repeated half seriously, "Obey the laws and wear the gauze." People being people, not everyone obeyed. The papers had a word, mask slackers, for gentlemen who wore theirs under the chin, but most folks tied the tapes and went on with their errands, breathing warm through cotton. The influenza came in with the war news that September, and the town has answered it the way small towns answer most things, which is to say together, and mostly at the level of the kitchen. The Board of Health has closed the schools, the moving picture house, the lodge halls and the church. Services are suspended, though the bell still rings the hour which everyone finds steadying. When a household falls sick, a card is tacked to the front door, a small printed placard that says influenza, and after that the neighbours do not knock. But they do not stay away either. They leave things. That is the particular genius of this town in this season. The porch becomes a kind of altar of small kindnesses. A covered pot of broth, still warm under a folded dish towel, a loaf wrapped in a flour sack cloth, half a dozen eggs in a basket, a jar of onion syrup, a note weighted down with a stone. Pot on the porch, leave the pot, we'll fetch it. You can walk the length of Elm Street at dusk and read the whole story of the epidemic in what is sitting quietly on the porch boards. Elsie is one of the carriers of pots. With the school shut, the town's 2 teachers have volunteered as home nurses, and Elsie, who is quick and calm and had thought about nursing anyway, goes with them on their rounds. What they do in the sick rooms is not complicated, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is almost exactly what Agnes did in her village, and Mary in her parish. All those centuries before, they keep the patient warm and lying down. They open the window a crack because the doctors that year believed mightily in fresh air. They spoon in beef tea and milk toast and gruel. The newspapers printed whole columns of what was called invalid cookery. They change the linen. They cool the forehead. They wind the clock so the room has a heartbeat, and they stay. Rest, broth, clean sheets, and someone who stayed. The remedies around the edges are a small museum of their own. Mustard, plasters, and goose grease for the chest. Quinine from the druggist. And, on the children of the cautious, little cloth sachets of camphor worn on a string around the neck, so that a schoolyard, when the schoolyards open again, will smell faintly of it for a year. The children, for their part, have made the sickness into a skipping rhyme, because that is how children carry what is too big for them. I had a little bird. Its name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza. You can hear it faintly from some backyard keeping time with a rope against packed earth. The telephone office matters more than it ever has. The town's exchange is a switchboard in a front room, and the operator, everyone just calls her Central, has become the epidemic's quiet dispatcher, plugging calls from farmhouse to doctor, keeping a penciled list of which households need broth and which need the nurse next. Historians still wonder, gently, how many were pulled through that winter by nothing more remarkable than a neighbour with a full pot and an operator with a good memory. And then, on a cold morning in November, every bell and whistle in town goes off at once, and it is not the sickness. It is the armistice. The war is over. People stand on their porches in their gauze masks and cheer and cry a little. And the two great weathers of that year, the war and the influenza, begin slowly to pass together. By the new year the sickness thins. The school reopens to the smell of chalk and camphor. The placards come down one by one. The town has borne its hard winter the way towns do. Not with any single act of heroism, but with 10,000 small kindnesses, stitched and simmered and carried up porch steps, and far away, in a cluttered London laboratory that nobody's thinking about at all, the next chapter of this long story is waiting patiently on an untidy workbench in a little glass dish. That little glass dish deserves a chapter of its own, so let us go and stand quietly beside it. It is early September 1928, at St Mary's Hospital in Paddington. London, and a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming has just come back from his summer holiday. Fleming is, by every fond account of the people who worked with him, a gentle and slightly untidy man. His workbench is famous in the building, stacked with culture plates other researchers would long since have scrubbed and put away. Before he left, he had seeded a batch of shallow glass dishes with common germs and set them aside in a corner, and now, back in his cardigan with the window light coming grey off the wet rooftops, he begins going through the stack, lifting each lid for a look before the dish is washed. And then he stops. On one plate near the edge, a blue-green blot of mould has settled in. A spore drifted, most likely from another laboratory in the building. And all around that mould there is a clear ring, a little moat of empty glass where the germs have simply melted away. Fleming looks at it for a moment and says, in the mildest voice imaginable, "That's funny. That is the whole thunderclap. No bells, no shouting down the corridor, just a curious man in a quiet room, turning a dish in the light. He grows the mould in broth, finds the broth carries the same gentle power, calls it mould juice for a while because he cannot help himself, and then gives it a proper name after the mould's own family, penicillin. It takes another decade and a war for the funny dish to become a medicine. A patient team at Oxford coaxing the mould to grow in whatever vessels a short-handed laboratory could find. Bedpans and milk churns and biscuit tins among them. And then American factories taking it up until, by the summer of 1944, there was enough for every wounded soldier who needed it. There is even a small homely legend inside the big one. The strain that finally grew best of all was found on an ordinary cantaloupe in a market in Peoria, Illinois, spotted by a laboratory assistant the town remembered afterward, affectionately as Mouldy Mary. From a drifting spore and a market melon, that is the unlikely, kitchen-scaled shape of one of the great mercies of the modern world, and while penicillin was being coaxed into being, another team was looking somewhere even humbler, down into the dirt. In a soil laboratory at Rutgers, in New Jersey, Selman Waxman and his students spent years patiently sifting the crowded, quarrelsome world of soil microbes, on the theory that creatures which had been competing underground for 100 million years might know a few things worth learning. In 1943, a graduate student named Albert Schatz, working in a basement room, drew out of a common soil organism the medicine they named streptomycin. It could do what nothing in this whole long story had ever done. It could cure tuberculosis. And, here is the sentence I have been walking toward all night, So let it come slowly. It could cure the plague. The old pestilence itself, the germ Yersin had finally seen in his bamboo hut in Hong Kong. The shadow that walked through Athens' harbour fever and Justinian's grain ships and Agnes's village and Mary's London and Jean's Marseille. That ancient enemy, met at last with a week of ordinary injections, fades and is gone, and the patient sits up and asks for supper. Plague still exists in our world, in wild burrows and quiet corners. A small number of people meet it every year, and nearly all of them treated promptly. Simply get better and go home. What burned through continents is now, almost entirely, a curable illness with a modest course of medicine. Centuries of fear, answered by a dish, a melon, and a handful of soil. The vaccines kept their own quiet promises too. The little scratch on the arm that Jenna offered at his vicarage went out into the world, generation by generation, until in 1980 the world's health ministers could declare, soberly and truthfully, that smallpox, the speckled monster itself, was gone from the earth entirely, the first disease human beings ever saw all the way out the door. The last person on earth to catch it naturally, a hospital cook in Somalia in 1977, recovered and spent much of the rest of his life helping vaccinate children against other things, which is worth sitting with for a moment. Influenza, Elsie's winter guest, got its own vaccines within a generation of her sewing at that kitchen table. And underneath all of it, quieter than any of it, the water kept running clean, Snow's Map and Bazalgette's brick rivers still doing their patient work under every modern street, saving more lives every ordinary Tuesday than most medicines manage in a year. But here is the thing I most want to hand you before we turn for home. Set the laboratories aside for a moment, wonderful as they are, and look back down the whole long road we have walked tonight. And notice how little the heart of survival ever changed. In every century, under every kind of sky, it looked the same. Clean water, when people could get it. Rest in a warm place. Broth, carried carefully so it wouldn't spill. Clean linen. A window opened or a fire banked according to the wisdom of the age. And someone who stayed, a Corinna, an Agnes, a Mary, an Elsie. Someone sitting in the low light within arm's reach, keeping the small machinery of care turning. The medicines, when they finally came, did not replace any of that. They joined it, the way a strong new voice joins a song already centuries long. People survived because people tended each other. That was true under the walls of Athens, and it was true on Elm Street, and it is true tonight wherever you are resting. And now the lamp is asking us gently to turn around, because every journey like ours ends the way it began, at the doorway where we first came in. So we turn, you and I, and find that the road back is not long at all. That is the kind thing about journeys made by lamplight. All those centuries we walk through are still there behind us, opening off this one quiet corridor like rooms in a great sleeping house. And as we walk back toward our own doorway, we can pause at each threshold for a last look, without waking anyone. Come slowly. There is no need to hurry any of this. Here is the first room, the oldest one. Athens, on an autumn night after the sickness had gone. Corinna's small clay lamp burns on its shelf, the olive oil nearly spent, the flame the size of an almond. Her household is asleep. The well rope is coiled. The barley jar has its lid on. She cups her hand behind the flame and breathes it out, and the room joins the darkness gently, like a swimmer slipping into warm water. A few doors along the corridor, Livia's Roman brazier has burned down to a rosy heap of coals that tick softly as they cool, a sound like a tiny clock. And in Theodosia's bakehouse on the harbour hill of Constantinople, the great ovens drawn hours ago are still giving up their stored warmth to the dark, and will still be faintly warm when she lays tomorrow's fire before dawn. Cities remember, we said once tonight, and recover, so do ovens. And here, stay a moment longer at this door because we know this room best of all. Agnes's cottage, in her English village, in the good years after. Supper is cleared, the hens are shut in, the spindle rests on the bench. She kneels at the hearth in the deep russet dark and does the last task of every medieval day. She banks the fire, raking the grey ash up and over the living embers, tucking them in so that the seed of fire will keep till morning under its warm blanket. Not out, never quite out, just kept, the way everything in her world was kept, covered, tended, trusted to last the night. That small mound of banked ash, glowing faintly from within, may be the truest picture this whole long story has offered us. The village church sits quiet beyond her garden. The bell will not ring until morning, and when it rings it will only be telling the hour. Farther along, Katerina's lantern at the harbour gate of the Sea Republic has been trimmed and hung for the night watch, throwing its patient gold ring on black water where the ships ride out their 40 days. Patience itself, burning at a wick. Then London. Mary's shop is shuttered, the boards up, the bolt shot, the smell of nutmeg and sugar shut in with the dark for company. But listen, the shutters are the ordinary kind now, closed for nothing worse than night time, and the little bell over the door will ring again at 7 sharp. On the Marseille quay, Jean's grey shawl hangs by the door, and the boats knock softly against their moorings, keeping their own slow time. Even the old plague wall up in the hills of Provence has gone soft-shouldered with moss by now, a boundary kept so faithfully that one day nobody needed it anymore. And in the last room before ours, in a small American town, Elsie carries her kerosene lamp up the stairs, one hand curled around the top of the glass chimney, shadows swinging gently on the wallpaper, and at her door she leans down and blows across it, and the hallway lets go of its light without any fuss at all. One by one you see the hearths go quiet. That is not the sad part of the story. That was never the sad part. A fire banked is a fire trusted to be wanted again in the morning. A lamp blown out is a day completed. A shuttered shop is a shop with something worth opening for. Every quiet hearth we have passed tonight belonged to people who had every reason to believe the dark was stronger than they were, and who tended their small lights anyway, and fed each other, and sat with each other, and were by any honest measure right in the end. The pestilences came, and the people, taken all together, stayed. They are the reason there was a morning after every one of those nights, and the reason there is a you, warm under your own roof, listening. And now we are back where we began, in our own lamplit room, and I can feel the night settling in around us like a deep quilt. There is nothing left that needs doing. The sentries are all tucked in behind us, the ash raked over the embers, the lanterns trimmed, the doors gently latched, all those good people sleeping the sleep of those who did what the day asked of them. You can let each of them go now. One breath at a time, let go of Athens, let go of the village and the harbour and the shop bell. Keep only, if you like, the warmth they all shared, broth on the fire, a hand on a blanket, someone near, because that warmth was always the true medicine. And it is yours tonight too. Your breathing has grown slower, I think. Good. Let it. The lamp beside us is down to its softest glow now, and I am going to lower it the rest of the way while you settle deeper into the pillow, and there is no need to listen closely anymore. No need to follow the words, only the sound of them, drifting, the way snow drifts past a window you're watching from somewhere warm. And so the house grows quiet, the last light settles, and everything that needed doing today is done. Sleep well, my friend. I'll be here again next time, with another quiet corner of history to sit inside of together. Until then, rest easy, and let this long, slow night finally close softly around you.